in our sessions this weekend on Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And I decided, even though this is the shortest of the book, to spend 2 sessions on the Machiavelli, if that's agreeable to you, and I want to explain my reasons why. The Machiavelli, or put it this way, that those 4 books together make up the block that one might call modern natural right. You can divide the history of political philosophy very easily, very simply, into 3 periods. You see the ancient natural right teaching, the Socratic foundings, the modern natural right teaching, which, essentially Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, the state, what we know as the state of nature, and then the historical school, or historicism. And I believe that there are really only those 3. Within them, of course, there are great divergencies, but you say that each of those 3 schools begins with the same fundamental premises, the same fundamental problems, and tries to elaborate a specific understanding of nature, or, well, in the case of the most modern school, of history. This segment of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, with Machiavelli as its underpinning, is not the most modern school, nor even the most influential in the way of thought, but it is the school upon which liberal democracy is founded, our institutions, and therefore it's of the greatest importance. My argument, of course, is that Machiavelli is the most fundamental figure in that school, even though he's largely not understood to be a member of that school, but that he provided the fundamental, I don't want to use the overworked term, revolution that brought about the new teachings of natural right or natural law as opposed to the old. You may be surprised. I mean, usually the way of dividing political philosophy is ancient philosophy, medieval philosophy, and modern philosophy. But my understanding, at least within the political, is that medieval philosophy does not differ essentially from the ancient. I think that's the way they understood themselves, to the extent that it's political philosophy. I mean, obviously, to the extent that it's Mohammedan, Christian, or Jew, certain adaptations had to take place, but that, what you might call theological or question of faith. But in terms of what the good regime is, what natural right and natural law are, they essentially understood themselves simply to be following or adapting, Aristotle. I think it's always wise to follow men's own self-understanding until you find that it's inadequate. And this was the view that was held by, as I said, people like Thomas or Averroes or Maimonides in the first place, and in the second place, their opponents regarded them as essentially the same as the ancients. So I don't think that there is that same kind of fundamental break. There's a fundamental new problem, of course, the biblical revelation that occurs between ancient and medieval thought. But that was not the question of political philosophy. The question of political philosophy is what's the good regime, and therein I don't think that there is a fundamental distinction. If you want to discuss that, I could stop on that issue for a moment. But that is the way in which I understand it, that somehow there is ancient philosophy in which we would, ancient political philosophy in which medieval would be one subsection. I believe that's the way Machiavelli took it, as well as the practitioners themselves. Would you agree with that formula, Ernest? You know that infinitely better.
Even temper that, but the whole Christian medieval period provides no input into the foundations of the modern
Yes, I would. I do not believe that school. I don't know enough about it. I mean, obviously, certain sorts of things started happening. I mean, practical things. The usual thing that's pointed to is representation. But I believe that the meaning of what a representative is is entirely different. I mean, a representative was somebody who went to the king to ask for something, not as a bearer of legitimacy. And I think that requires, I mean, that we can discuss when we come to Hobbes and Locke. I think that absolutely that was a crucial transformation. Though, you know, there's always a desire to see all good things in one's own tradition. We begin by assuming that democracy is a good thing, and we assume, you know what our tradition is, therefore, what your tradition is, and what must be, it must be there. And I do think that it comes from a certain kind of wishful thinking. I mean, I don't know those arguments very well. I've heard them, and I've never been impressed. I think, I mean, in a way, this allows me to attach it immediately to Machiavelli. I think that the fundamental newness of Machiavelli is underestimated not only within the Catholic teaching, but by all scholars these days, and that one tries to find a certain continuity of development. You know, I think you probably heard this already. Well, The Prince is a very traditional book. You know, there were the mirrors of the princes, and it goes back to a practical tradition and a theoretical tradition which existed previously. And of course, one can read the book in that way, or just as one can look for all the traditional things. But then, of course, one has to forget a lot of passages in it. And of course, my argument, what I'm going to try to discuss with you, is that a really radical break was made with Machiavelli. Essentially, I don't like these kinds of categorizations, kind of historical categorizations, but you can say that the school that says that democracy came out of the medieval practice and theory denies that there was a Renaissance. No, I don't think I wouldn't say there was a Renaissance, an important thing, but that Machiavelli and 2 or 3 other people really made a fundamental change. And I can say that, a sort of règle générale for the interpretation of classical texts, or classic texts, is not to find their similarities with other books, but to find their differences. And I think that our tendency is to look too much for the influences, the samenesses, and so on, and to see the real difference. And Machiavelli hides that difference because, he's quite explicit about it, but he's explicit, but in a very low-key way, and so one has to look for it. But it was Machiavelli was understood to be a radical break by the people who hated him, and I think people's enemies at the time are very good judges. Historians aren't aren't involved with what the real practical issue is. So yeah, my answer would be certainly. Ernest would be able to talk about this much better than I can, but I as a student, listen to Maritain occasionally and so on, and they really have to pull out passages from Thomas or something like that, which don't really mean very much and which don't differ very much from Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle had not a preference for democracy, but he thought it was very important to have consent. But you can say, I would say, if you want a quick formulation, that all power is derived from the consent of the governed is the modern formulation, and I don't think anybody held that before. Machiavelli didn't say that, but the people who built on Machiavelli's revolution. That's my answer to it. But the reason why I want to spend so much time on Machiavelli is not only the fundamental character of it. I know this is a teaching program, and I always find that Machiavelli is, if properly taught, not to say I teach it properly, but with some kind of attention, some kind of passion, can be the most moving book for students, the most striking experience, and can lead them very well into the whole tradition of political philosophy. These last 3 or 4 years, I've used it as the introductory book in the introductory course, instead of beginning with Plato or Aristotle as I used to, and I found it was a much better way to begin. Another thing I might suggest, by the way, is that they use this edition, which is not, the translation is no good, but it's got Italian on the other face, and it gives them a chance to look across at words, which is a very good, there's some continually bad translations, and if you start pointing that out to them, it interests them, and that they can look across and say, did he really say that? Even if they don't know Italian, they can just look for the words like Fortuna, virtue, which plays such an important role. But so, and now the question is, why is the book so attractive? I mean, just to the students in the first place, it sort of fits their view, their cynical view of what politics is. I mean, either from the point of view is, we can be good, solid scientists, and really look at politics, see the way it's practiced. And Machiavelli's tough. Second place, Machiavelli has a bad reputation, so young people, particularly today, enjoy the notion that they're sinning, having a little vice, and reading and knowing Machiavelli will have that quality, it's a little experience with the devil. And in the third place, after they have got, you say that the book does present politics, as it's ordinarily practiced and as they are likely to recognize it. And then as they're reading it, in a way, what seems commonplace, they realize is an interpretation, a very strong interpretation of the phenomenon, for which there are alternatives. I think their usual way of looking at things, there are these people up in the air like Plato, who have very nice motives, and then there are the hard realists like Machiavelli. But it's in a way, by way of Machiavelli, that you can see that Plato is more realistic than is thought, and perhaps even more realistic than Machiavelli. Once they see what Machiavelli is doing, how radically, in a way, idealistic Machiavelli was. So it's a combination. They get a real view of politics that they recognize, and then suddenly they realize that view of politics that they have is one that's been very much affected by Machiavelli, that they themselves are pupils or students of Machiavelli without having known it. That's a very interesting experience for them. Their first understanding usually is, Machiavelli is the founder of either tough power politics or of Hitler or something like that. But when you can easily show them that Machiavelli is much more the father of a certain kind of liberal democracy, which most of them accept, that comes as a big experience for them. And that opens, you see, when you begin with Plato and Aristotle, that's so distant from them that, that even if they're sort of interested in it, it's really very academic, whereas the Prince can really grab them. And the fourth reason why the book is, I think, so it's a very beautifully written book, and it's a very good book for teaching them how to read. It's so carefully written, very charming, very funny, but on the surface of it, just disordered, very conventional. I mean, vicious but conventional in its viciousness and so on. And then as they see how the thing develops, and they learn, it has a tremendous cast of characters. One of the things to do in teaching it is to really teach it as though we were teaching War and Peace, some kind of novel that has a lot of characters. Tell them to make a chart, of the characters as they keep coming back in, and they get very involved with the different people and so on. So this is my reason that it's of all the books that I'm discussing, the most tightly written. It's the most radical, and it's the one that is also most likely, I think, to engage the attentions of the students if taught. I don't know. Have you been teaching it yet this year?
No, we're going to do it.
Starting next week.
So what I'd like to do is just go through it with you. And that's the reason why I want to spend, both sessions today going through it. I mean, I find myself every year, of course, this is partly just the garrulousness of old age, but I find myself taking longer and longer on it, and the students, enjoying it more and more as I've gotten to know it better, and, the simple delight of it. So what I'd just like to go through it, and please interrupt when you have difficulties. Is anybody lacking a text? No, I can't do anything about that. But
maybe we could, Brian and I will share this.
If I can't mark it, it's not going to be that much.
What?
If I can't mark it, it's not going to be that much use anyway.
The very title is of some interest. The Prince. and the word, what the prince is, isn't clear, and it keeps changing out the book. But there's a book about, but the simple first meaning is, of course, a single lone ruler, and if one thing was something ought to be aware of, the classic distinction was between prince and tyrant, or king and tyrant, prince and tyrant, the legitimate versus the illegitimate, or the good versus the bad ruler. And a characteristic of the prince, the book The Prince, is that the distinction between prince and tyrant disappears. I mean, everybody's a prince who rules. And the reason why, this, somebody might say, well, Machiavelli just wasn't talking about that, but in his other book, the Discourses, of course, he maintains the distinction. So this book, in a way, begins by a kind of indifference to that question, which was, the moral way of looking at rulers, the prince versus the tyrant. And people he calls princes here in the Discourses, he calls tyrant. Let me say, by the way, in case you have this problem, there's always some wiseacre in class who's read a Will Durant's history of philosophy or something that will tell you, well, why are you reading this and not the Discourses? Or the Discourses, here he was more radical, but what he really wanted was democracy, or as you can see, or republicanism, as you can see from the Discourses. Don't be intimidated by that. The simple answer one has to give is, of course, one has to read each book on its own. But the second, because the teaching is essentially the same in the two books. The fundamental teaching, and this book states it perhaps more radically from we'll see from what standpoint, but there is no essential difference. To the extent that he's more interested in republics in the Discourses, it's on the same grounds, from the same point of view, that he discusses princes here. But I just make that general statement. It's very interesting also to look at the table of contents. The book has a very conventional form. The headings are in Latin, and the body of the text is in Italian. And if you read the chapter headings, looking at the table of contents, every one of those chapter headings, you wouldn't have any idea that this is a very nasty book. That they're very conventional sounding, on the civil principality, whether it is better to be loved than feared, or the opposite. You see, he doesn't say it's better to be feared than loved, which is what he says in the body of the text. But you see, anybody who just leaves through would see a very conventional book. And that's part of his way of teaching. He's not an immoralist in the straight-out way. He recognizes that a certain conventional surfaces, and that's the kind of beauty of it, as I say, when you have this, whether it's feared to be better to be feared or loved. He makes it. You assume, of course, that he would say it's better to be loved, and then the kind of humor comes about that it just becomes doctrinal that it's better to be feared, and that's something of the style of the book. Could I withdraw just one step again to say something about the general reputation? There are, I suppose, three great schools of opinion about what Machiavelli is. And the students, to the extent they've heard of Machiavelli at all, of course they all have heard of Machiavelli somehow, I suppose. I don't know. Has everybody had anything? Some of them haven't even heard the name?
No.
Because that's... You really had that? Because usually, it's,
Admission requirements are lower.
It's not that they know anything. I don't assume that any students know anything any place. But it's just that that's in every newspaper and so on. But I suppose they don't read the newspapers as much, Well, even the sports pages would speak of the Machiavellian Walter O'Malley. What?
Not in Boston. I've never seen it.
Sports writers tended to be very florid. That's the experience. Yeah. the but the, well, but there are three general opinions, and I mean, all of which are wrong, but have something to them. And one shouldn't get stuck on one or the other. And to the extent that students are stuck on one or the other, one really has to keep disenchanting them with that one. I mean, the first reaction, the old style reaction, was that Machiavelli is an evil man, and a man who helped out tyrants. And now, of course, today people don't like the pose of that kind of moralism. There's a great love of pose of moralism in our day and age, but not that kind of pose of moralism. So everybody says, "Oh, that's nothing. He was just realistic," or something like that. But it's a little like Henry Miller. Henry Miller lost all his charm when sex got to be so easily talked about. In the same way, Machiavelli would lose his own intention if everybody said, well, the world is tough, there shouldn't be more moral considerations, shouldn't guide politicians or something like that. He meant to be a teacher of shocking and evil things. I mean, that isn't the last word on it, and one would lose one's perspective if one wants an art too clever. The other two, which are more popular, are less, I think, well-grounded than the position that he's evil. The others are more sophisticated. One is that he's the founder of nationalism. And the second is that he's the founder of the social sciences, objective, as opposed to, full of value judgments. Well, you'll see he's constantly praising and blaming throughout the book, saying this is right and this is wrong and so on. So the social science thing is not true, other than to prove that the social scientists just like a low view of man, which Machiavelli doesn't. And the nationalism thing, in a way, it's true, but of course there were people who loved their countries before Machiavelli, and it's a new mode of nationalism. Nationalism founded on something new, and which also in itself goes beyond nationalism. I mean, we'll talk about that when we get to chapter 26. Okay. The dedicatory letter is beautiful, and it should be read with some care, and I'd like to go over it with you carefully. It's Niccolo Machiavelli, to the magnificent Lorenzo de' Medici. Now, there are two things. It's always said that Machiavelli was looking for a job, which in a way he presents himself as. Now, and that's the reason why he said to write the book. But the whole question is whether that exhausts it. You can say what one knows from reading the book, and you have to read the book in this way, sure. It is a book written to a prince. And therefore you have to be constantly thinking and reading it, not only what Machiavelli is saying, but what Machiavelli would be saying to a prince as opposed to a close friend, or to a Republican, to a Democrat or something like that. I mean, there's no question that he sets it in the context. Let's assume he's looking for a job. That's the way he presents himself. Well, the man who's looking for a job has to, do a certain kind of sales job. And in a way, he prepares you by this. Now, here's Niccolo to the magnificent Lorenzo de' Medici. Now, who do you think he's writing to? Obviously, Lorenzo, the great Lorenzo. But it's not. You see, this is a nephew, a second-rate nephew who never came to anything, and I think you'll see that Machiavelli doesn't have much expectation. But he begins by bloating him. He begins by flattering. And you, from the beginning of this, you get the idea he was writing to the to the great tyrant, which is what Lorenzo, the great Lorenzo de' Medici was. He was writing to the great tyrant. Now, that's the first case of bloating, and he says it is customary in most cases for those who desire to win the favor of a prince. You see, this is an important thing. To present them, so that means to say that gifts are mercenary. That's it's what is liberality to a prince? It's an investment. I mean, that's not a great activity of generosity. To present themselves to him with those things they cherish most, or which they know please him most. Now you see there are two criteria there. What they themselves like best, you give up the thing you have most, or you want to give what the prince wants. Hence we often see princes presented with horses, arms, gold, vestments, precious stones, and similar adornments worthy of their greatness. Desiring then to offer myself to your magnificence with some proof of my devotion to you, I have not found among my possessions anything that I cherish more or value so much as my knowledge of the accomplishments, of great men. Now, what's the problem here? Do you see a kind of, excuse me for being kind of, this is the way in which I would teach it, and there's no reason why you shouldn't go through it in exactly the same way. I mean, what's the problem in the very presentation of the gift? Yeah.
The prince is obviously not interested in knowledge as much as he is in wealth.
He's
flattering him to make him believe it.
Well, he doesn't say that the prince is. I mean, there's a tension between the two. There's what the prince wants, and there's what Machiavelli has most valuable. And the only way in which the two could possibly have harmony is if what Machiavelli had was Machiavelli had a lot of money, and the prince wanted money, or Machiavelli had a lot of wisdom and the prince wanted wisdom. But that's, in a way, the great problem of the relationship between, power and knowledge. And that's the classic problem, that's Plato's problem in the formulation philosopher kings. And in a way, all that Machiavelli's revolution is already implied in the sentence, at least the implication, that somehow there's going to be a new relationship established between prince and advisor to prince, or power and wisdom. But he does this in such a charming way. He said, there are these two things, horses and money and so on, whereas what I'm giving is knowledge. It also shows, by the way, what Machiavelli stands for. Machiavelli himself was a great knower, as one will see, a strange kind. In the Jew of Malta, in the preface to the Jew of Malta, there's by Marlowe, there's a soliloquy by Machiavelli, which he says, "I hold there is no sin but ignorance," which is a very beautiful and very understanding statement about Machiavelli. But this is a funny situation. The point is, of course, he's giving the prince something the prince would probably have no interest in at all. That's and that's the problem. But it's something that the prince, I think his implication is, of course, it's what Machiavelli cherishes most, and which would be most good for the prince. And then the question is, how are you going to get the prince to accept it? That's that you can say is the fundamental problem of Machiavelli. You can say Plato's answer was you can never get the princes to accept it. Their passions, their self-interest, and so on is such that, in the fundamental way, they can't be changed. But he does this so delicately and humorously. This is and what is it he knows? The experiences of the accomplishments of great men. Now, why great men would be useful for Lorenzo de Medici unless he's going to be a great man? It's hard to say. And then he goes on, which I learned. You see, and here's another double problem. I learned through long experience in contemporary affairs. I think della cosa moderna, of modern things, and a continual reading of the ancient ones. Now, you see, I think another problem involved here. There's a dualism here. Experience of modern things and a reading of ancient things. Why would the experience of modern things not be enough? As you're going to see, this is going to become one of the great themes of the whole book, ancient modern. Why would the understanding of modern things not be enough? I mean, why would you have to read ancient things? I mean, is in a way going to become what?
Understand the modern things.
Why? I mean, if human nature is always the same, why do you need?
Yes. The past has influenced men in such a way that what they do today is the result of what they have learned from ancient order.
Machiavelli rather tend to say something much more practical, like those who do not know the past are condemned to repeat it?
Well, yeah, but you could have, over, an experience of 50 years, why not? I mean, this presents itself as a form of history. It's not history, I think you'll see, precisely because it's a combination of reading ancient things and modern things and bringing them together. But I think his suggestion is going to be that there's something absolutely different about modern things, and that the ancient things are necessary not because of the universal principles which you state, but because there's, it's as though, one had lived always in a democracy and didn't know there were monarchies, as a real human alternative, or one had always lived in a democracy. I mean, the thing which is the real change, I think, is not that, but that there's something lacking in modern times. Modern experience isn't enough, that if you have a modern experience, you have an experience which is limited. Or in a way, what you suggested, you have to have the proper context for judging the modern experience. The modern experience isn't sufficient. I mean, the men who appear to be great, the actions which appear to be good, wouldn't always appear to be great and good in every context. So you have to have another context. But, and that's the reason why the book is not merely historical. Somehow you have to look. But what's the problem with reading about ancient things? You see, the modern experience, the problem with the modern experience is, of course, the modern experience is too narrow. What's the problem with reading the ancient things?
Experience.
You got to trust the authors. Those two things I think you'll find, are the real issue of the whole book. The limitations of the modern experience and the problems connected with reading books, trusting books, and Machiavelli somehow is going to try to solve that issue. That's a really gorgeous. And then he says, this is really very funny. He says, having very diligently for a long time thought about and analyzed these accomplishments, and now having condensed them into una piccolo volume redotta, excuse my Italian. Do you see what he's concentrating on? It's a short book. You can read it. This is, his prince is presumably out riding horseback all the time. And so on. And you see his other book, which is written to potential princes, or men who ought to be princes but who are in private life. It's a very long book. And he says it contains exactly the same stuff, but they have time to read it carefully. See, here he gives him, he keeps insisting on the shortness of it. Read it, it's so short. And then he says, well, I could not make you a greater gift than to give you the means to be able in a very short time, poter in brevissimo tempo intendere tutto quello che io in tanti anni e con tanti miei disagi e periculo ho conosciuto e inteso. It has a peculiarly funny ring. He keeps. If you realize the situation, he's trying to get him to read it. So I say, it's short. You'll understand everything I did. Now the question is that possible? I mean, it's like a Dale Carnegie course. Years of getting along with people, and I can do it for you in a week. And make you popular. And then one would have to ask himself, what are all these terrible dangers, difficulties and dangers that he had to run? You see, he's giving him an easy way out, no dangers. And it takes on I believe intentionally amusing character. Then he says the book has no external qualities. And then, you see, then he states this situation. You see, he said, now, why? He has these sentences, I hope it will not be thought presumptuous of men of low and inferior station dare to debate and regulate the government of princes. You see, he's got a problem already. It can be understood to be insolence, to write a book to a superior. And he has to and it's not only insolence. I mean, what is a tyrant worried about always? Somebody who's going to try to take over. I mean, he took over. And so Machiavelli, and you'll see there are many references to this throughout the book, has to show A, that it's not presumptuous, and B, that he's not running a risk. And the way that the tyrant isn't running a risk in looking at him this way, or the prince isn't running a risk by harboring Machiavelli. And it's very funny. He makes this wonderful distinction. Princes and rulers. Mountains and valleys. Now, prince is on a mountain and he can see the valleys. He understands the nature of the people, whereas the people in the valley are the only ones who can see the mountains. You see, it's absolutely perfect. But I mean, that's of course utter nonsense, as you'll see from the book. He talks in many points about the nature of the people, and the question is whether those are distinguishable. You could deal with President Roosevelt without talking about the American people, or where Roosevelt could talk about the American people without understanding the nature of his own presidency. I mean, it's nonsense. But it has a certain character, and then he promises him that he will get a greatness which fortune and your other qualities promise you. Now, that really is an interesting thing. I mean, you're going to see the word the two most important words in the book, which have to be followed through, which unfortunately are not. Sadly, are not properly translated by the author. I mean, he keeps losing his nerve. Are fortune and virtue. And you'll see. Now, the question is: fortune, somebody having good fortune, is that a quality of a human being? Somebody's always lucky, at the races or something like that. You can't say that's a quality in the same way that being strong or being chaste or honest or something like that is. But he speaks of it having fortune and his other qualities, and then Machiavelli describes himself. He says he has a great and continual malignity of fortune. That's another, which seems to be something quite external. This is terribly important because it's in chapter 25, which is perhaps the most important theoretical chapter in the book. He discusses the whole problem of Fortuna, fortune. But here in this very simple way. You have good fortune and other qualities, but as though fortune were one of his qualities. Elsewhere, of course, he speaks of virtue in people's qualities. The question is, what is the real quality of this young man? But that's the epistle dedicatory. Machiavelli, the knower, coming, but the humble as can possibly be, coming to this great man and begging him to read his little book. It's rather pretty, yeah, and at the same time showing, of course, the problems of this prince, indicating that he probably likes horses, better than learning, and indicating that he holds his position essentially by good luck. I'm sorry, I don't have a blackboard. I don't usually do this, but. That's the epistle. That's the epistle dedicatory, and the first chapter is of some interest. The general character of the prince, if you know it, is very strange. It's a very strange book. It appears to be disordered. It has these little chapters, and it has a strange variation of style. If you look at chapter 1. It's a very scholastic. It's just like a scholastic treatise, distinctions, and things laid out in order. If you look at chapter 26, it's a great poem and an exhortation, something close even to the Communist Manifesto in style, if you like. It's a strange book moving between those two poles of a highly academic book and one that seems to make a tremendous popular appeal. And a strange kind of role for political philosophy. In one way, it's very traditional, scholastic, and then the other, suddenly political philosophy appearing as almost a kind of salvation. And chapter 1 begins in this very scholastic way. And what he does is he divides up the types of principalities and the way they are acquired. The way you see, this is the important set of distinctions. There are principalities and republics, and then in dealing with principalities, there are old ones and there are new ones. Of new ones, there are partly new ones and entirely new ones. And they are acquired, the new ones, either by one's own arms or somebody else's arms, and either by fortune or by virtue. Now, that in a way seems like a bore if you can outline it on, I mean, not a bore, I mean, it's useful and so on, but not a strictly technical thing. But if you think back to Aristotle, and this is something worth showing to students, I think, Aristotle distinguishes between 6 kinds of regimes. Autocracy and democracy, oligarchy and aristocracy, and kingship and tyranny. I mean, essentially he makes a fundamental distinction between good and bad regimes, and that the good regime of the one, the few, and the many, and the bad regime of the one, the few, and the many. If you look at Machiavelli's setup, it has a very different orientation, and in a way you get the whole difference in Machiavelli's perspective from this. What's missing in the first place? The distinction between good and bad, which is very, 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 and what was the reason for Machiavelli's distinction between good and bad? I mean, Aristotle's. I mean, well, he spoke about it just from the terms of the effect of the regime on the good life. And what kind of life you could lead, and so, or you could say, or whether the rulers were interested in the public or whether they were interested in the private. And Machiavelli seems to say that's not a real distinction. Perhaps, I think the implication is that everybody's always interested in his private interest, so that's a fake distinction. Right. There's another, but I think one can get it deeper if one looks at this understanding of the difference in orientation. What is the real goal? What's the really interesting thing about this setup? I mean, you see, for Aristotle, it's whether the regime is good or bad, whether it's public-spirited or not. What's this one? What's the purpose? What's the end implied in this set of divisions? I mean, what's the interest? Aristotle's interest is in governing properly. What's the interest? I mean, it's in the title, essentially, here. I mean, what is the cause of this particular set of distinction? It's acquisition. The getting. You see, and here I think you see the fundamental difference between Aristotle and Machiavelli in the simplest possible way. Aristotle talks about what you should do with a regime when you got it, when you got a country or something like that. Machiavelli talks about how you get it. You see the great strength of Machiavelli's position. I mean, what's lacking in Aristotle's politics when you read it? He doesn't tell you how you get control of a country, how you get a country. He sort of assumes it's there. It's the same thing in Aristotle's ethics. I mean, what's Aristotle's great virtue, or one of the great virtues? Liberality. But in order to be liberal, what have you got to have? Money. How do you get the money? Aristotle doesn't tell you that. You inherit it. And somehow or other, this is the great, this is the indication of the great difference in orientation. And you see this in all modern times. Everybody still praises charity, liberality, and so on. But if you take a look, I mean, what is the fundamental discipline of modern politics, economics? How you get. Because you've got to be able to get before you can spend. And you can say that that's the sense in which Aristotle's understood to be a dreamer. Aristotle and Plato. And he's obviously thinking about them here. Now, what would Aristotle say? Well, of course you have to acquire, but that's not the crucial thing. It's like you've got to be healthy in order, to be a good soldier. But I don't write treatises on health so much, but I write treatises on being a good soldier. Which is there's something sensible about that. But what's Machiavelli's point in return? Aristotle tells you how to behave when you've got it. He tells you to be virtuous and so on. But the point is, in order to get it, you can't be virtuous in Aristotle's way. And if you can't be virtuous in Aristotle's way, then Aristotle is giving you a prescription for political failure. What I mean to say is, if, for example, you've got to commit a murder or start a revolution or have wars in order to establish a regime, and you're constantly telling people that they ought to be honest and not kill and be virtuous, you're destroying politics, because politics, the simplest formula you can give for this is that Aristotle states two, or put it this way, what's the end according to Aristotle's ethics? Happiness. What is happiness? Happiness is the same as the activity of virtue. But he adds a little something to that. The activity of virtue with a sufficient supply of equipment. So, Aristotle says, virtue plus equipment. Well, you see, the big problem, and that leads to a kind of duality, in a complexity in Aristotle's thought, that you have to have equipment and you have to exercise virtue. And there's a kind of assumption that the two are not assumption, but treatment as though the two were harmonious. But I think everybody knows that in order to make money, as John Kennedy said he learned from his father, and all businessmen are sons of bitches, that you have to be, that you have to do all kinds of nasty things. And since you've got to have the equipment first, in order to be virtuous, then you perhaps ought to concentrate more on equipment. That's, in a way, that's the kind of suggestion of this orientation. It's the old story, Well, let me make $1 million and then I'll be very generous and devote myself to culture and so on, But if I have to be a poor wage slave, and how am I going to, be generous and devote myself to culture and so on? And I think that's an absolutely almost irrefutable argument. It has a very great force, at least. And Machiavelli is the first to start writing on acquisition for princes. Now you can say that also fits with Prince's desires very nicely. He's not an old philosopher comes and says to the prince, you must learn humility, you must learn to govern kindly, and so on. The prince is likely to go, and be bored to death and so on, and say that this, he's not going to change me. But Machiavelli comes somehow accepting the orientation of a prince, and that's a new change in itself. A change in itself, a new orientation itself, to accept the point of view. A prince is interested in acquiring. Machiavelli teaches about acquisition, or at least appears to. That's all right. Don't that.
Problem of capital formation.
Absolutely. But it's a problem of capital formation, and that's not a mere joke. To say the language which he uses is much more military. But the people who followed him, Locke and so on, it is precisely that. That's the reason why I concentrate so much on Machiavelli, because the change in orientation that Machiavelli brings about is precisely what makes the preparations for life, or the equipment for life, so much at the center, and capital formation is one very, the most modern formulation of that. And so that's the, but the striking thing, you see, it's one thing to go and tell a capitalist, or a big businessman, you should give away all your money. Old John D. Rockefeller once wrote Tolstoy a letter, what should I do with my money? Just get rid of every bit of it immediately. Because the money is diabolical. That is not likely to be too impressive. But if you come to a businessman and say, I can tell you how to increase your money, if you can get him, that at least is not a crazy thing to begin with. He's not working on the conversion of the prince, at least in a very direct way, as you can see, which older political philosophy tended to do. So that's the first chapter. So even in this very dry chapter, you see a difference in orientation on the basis of the distinctions that are made. And of course, this virtue, one's own arms versus others' arms, virtue or fortune, and it becomes one of the crucial themes which we'll discuss as he develops it. Then chapter 2 is also a boring chapter. You see, how is he going to begin? I'm not going to discuss republics. Well, you'll see in chapter 5 he does, but I'm not going to discuss republics. I'm only going to discuss principalities. Now, why is he going to discuss principalities? In one sense, the situation because he's talking to a prince. And particularly since he lives in Florence, where the people really want a republic, that's a rather, it's like mentioning Rope in the House of a Hanged Man. It has some of that quality. And Machiavelli does play on the humor of these things. There's no question the book, as you will see, is meant to be very humorous. And one of the things that a successful result of teaching this is that when they read Machiavelli, they start giggling. That Machiavelli has, this charm of really being funny. But also, he's talking about, as you'll see more and more, about the beginnings of civil society in this book. And the beginnings of civil society, of course, are almost always by, single men, or at most a very small group of men conquering. And most of us never live in the beginnings of society, but you learn most about what society is really like by the way it begins, or the way life is when it begins. Did it begin in Eden, or did it begin, in a terrible war in the state of nature? That really makes a difference. So that has something to do with the orientation here, whereas in the other book, the discourse he discusses republics. But you see, he's going to start moving through the outline which he set up. The outline is old principalities, republics, principalities, discarding republics. Then principalities. It's important to follow the outline he sets up because he also breaks that outline, and in breaking that outline in a couple of places, he's indicating that he's doing something new. The book is very subtly written because you can't teach subtlety in an unsubtle way, and a prince is supposed to be subtle, and he's a way of giving the prince an education. And but he does set up this simple outline. Principalities, old principalities, new principalities, partially new, totally new. And as you'll see, chapters 2 is on old principalities, 3 is partially new, chapter 6 is all new. You see, so he covers that, and all new with one's own virtue. Chapter 7 is with fortune, and so on. By means of fortune. So you'll see he really has set up the outline. In chapter 2, he deals with old ones very, very rapidly. He's obviously not interested in that. As you'll see, the motion is gradually towards all new republics founded with one's own arms and one's own virtue. And without saying explicitly what he wants to do, the very organization of it leads you in that direction. His orientation is to the great founders. But this chapter 2 should not be completely neglected in teaching it, because it's very easy, he says, to maintain an old republic. Old principality. Now you'll see in the beginning of chapter 3, he indicates how easy it is to turn over an old principality. He's giving a certain kind of, he's lulling the prince who's in power into a kind of self-confidence. You see, Machiavelli begins with, you can see the traditional orientation is, what is the traditional orientation? Well, our way is going to go on. There'll be changes and so on, but our way is going to go on. And he gradually indicates that, things must be changed, but in the second place, the change and the danger of change, at the very least, is always present. See, it makes an awful lot of difference if the United States is not fundamentally threatened in foreign policy or from domestic enemies, then we can just obey the ordinary laws. If it's fundamentally threatened by clever and dangerous enemies, then of course, you have to have plumbers and CIA and so on. That's and then the question is, what is the fundamental situation? The old legalistic civil libertarians really assume the regime is quite powerful and steady, and therefore that it can, and I'm not saying that in practice that isn't a good rule to follow, but I'm saying that is somehow the presumption of that orientation, whereas the presumption of another kind of orientation is clearly that things can easily change. Therefore, we always must be ready and be constantly, carrying on espionage and things of that kind, which are, necessary aspects of threatening situations. And chapter 2, in a way, seems to lull into confidence, and he says it's very important. He says, since a prince by birth has fewer reasons and less need to offend his subject, it follows that he should be more loved. Now, it's quite striking that he'll say, later in the book, of course, the important thing is not to be loved in politics, and you shouldn't count on that. And he says that he should be loved, whereas if you notice the beginning of chapter 3, he immediately says it's very, very easy to take over a new regime because there are always a lot of dissatisfied people who, if you make promises to, will be willing to overthrow it. So chapter 2 is very provisional, and anybody who reads it too simply, particularly if you were a man in place, would likely to be lulled into too much confidence. It's very conventional, and for that reason you can see it's just terribly conventional. This passage says the Duke of Ferrara, who held up against the assaults of the Venetians in 1484 and of Pope Julius in 1510. Well, those are two different Dukes of Ferrara, but treats them as though they were the same. I mean, to say the traditional regimes, the men make no difference, the laws are what count. Now, that's chapter 2. You're going to say the first step, and now we start moving to the interesting things. Chapter 3, mixed principalities, and that's a long chapter. It's one of the longer chapters in the book, and this is the story of the unfortunate Louis XI. Louis the 12th. It's a very sad story. Now, if you look at it, you see it's how Louis the 12th. He, by the way, Louis is going to play a very important role in the book, and you have to keep the whole book. It's the story of how he took over in Italy. So we get this concentration on Italy and on conquests in Italy from the very beginning, and here it's the French king. There are two reasons. It's about taking over and holding on to. He says it's easy to take over. But the reason is that there are always people willing to change if you give them promises. But the problems begin from two things: that the people who wanted to change are never satisfied with what you can do for them. Secondly, the people that you have to be rough when you take over a place, and so you make enemies of those people. Now, the problem is, as he puts it, you see there's always a development in these chapters. I mean, they really are stories. The book can't be read like a treatise. You see, here's the problem. You are not able to keep those friends that helped to put you in power, since you're incapable of satisfying them in the way they had expected. Nor can you use drastic measures against them, for you are obligated to them. Because though one may have the strongest of armies, one always needs the backing of the inhabitants to take it over. You see, now here's the situation. You come in. You made friends and plotted beforehand. They brought you in. They're disappointed when you come in. So then they throw you out. Now here and he goes on. It is certainly true. Once those lands that have rebelled, you see, and why can't you take drastic measures against them? Because you're obligated to them. You have a moral obligation. They did you a favor. You have to be kind to them. But then you see, then they inevitably throw you out. Then you take it over the second time. Then what do you do the second time? The second time you kill them. Because you're no longer obligated to them. Yeah. Now, what would follow from this? I mean, if you're sensible.
First time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's what gets in the way here? Something absolutely evanescent. Morality. You see, but here Machiavelli puts it as though, you see, he stays very moral within this context. You see, it's going to be an inevitable thing. You plot to take over the country. You take it over. You've got to be thrown out because of your morality. Then, once your morality is taken care of, then you have to kill them. So you kill them the first time, what is the almost necessary implication of this passage. It is very funny, this passage. Now, the second time, but see, Louis lost it the second time. You see, this first time, the sad story of losing it the first time came because of Louis's wonderful morality. Of course, it's not mentioned, of course, how moral is it to want to take over Milan and such places. And he made a number of errors. And it's just a history of those errors, but I think we'll see that history, is connected with some very important, reflections. I won't go through the details of what or most of the details of what he says you should do, but he gives perfectly reasonable statements. You see, in the first place, you have to see that the blood of the old ruling house is extinguished. How you do that, he doesn't mention. It's left quite quiet. but it is perfectly. That's the problem of Henry IV. That he has to get rid of Richard. That you must. You can't have, legitimate kings hanging around. And then he talks about colonies. On page 13 of my, I think it goes further. But the province. He said. The subject would be satisfied in having direct recourse to the prince. This way, desiring to be good citizens, they have more reason to love him. And now he adds, and desiring to be otherwise than good citizens, more reason to fear him. Love is not sufficient. You have to have a reason, the source of fear. So it's either the prince goes and lives there himself, or he sends colonies, which means to say that if you send colonies, you send your own people. And here he starts coming up with these very harsh maxims for which Machiavelli is known. Now, it's my belief these harsh maxims are not the real hard part of Machiavelli. He said, the colonies do not cost much, and at little or no cost on the part of the prince, he can send and maintain. And he only hurts those whose fields and houses are taken and given to the new inhabitants, who are a very small part of that state. And those that he hurts, scattered and poor as they are, can never be a threat to him, and all the others remain on the one hand unharmed. Is it already 10 of 12? We'll take our break at 12:30. Is that all right? Is that the time that you expect to do it? Yeah. I think 2 hours is quite sufficient for anybody's concentration. But scattered and poor as they are, can never be a threat to him, and all the others remain on the one hand unharmed, and therefore they should be quiet now and fearful of making a mistake. That's what happened to those who had been dispossessed might happen to them. This is a very good example. You move in quick, throw out some people. There's a very good, simple practical reasonings. Those who are thrown away and scattered aren't very important, and the others are afraid of doing anything. Now, it's in this context, suddenly, for the first time, he starts mentioning the ancients. He starts talking about the ancient Romans, and that becomes the model here. Now, I think you'll discover, you see, and this is the important thing to understand, that he talks about the Romans. Roman history becomes very important here, the activity of the Roman Republic in particular. And I think you will observe throughout almost the entire book, it's certainly true in chapter 3, everything that Louis does is wrong. Everything the Romans do is right. Now, is there any reason why what the Romans do is right always, and what Louis does is always wrong? You see, I would suggest he suggests he knows modern things by experience and ancient things by reading. He knows Roman history. What is it that is the great change between Rome and Louis? I'll put that off for just 1 minute. I think it'll start becoming clear very quickly. But the Romans, he gives this wonderful description of the way the Romans behave, and a description of the foundings of the Roman Empire. The Romans were always everybody's allies. And the Romans, they always were helping other countries out. Absolutely wonderful. There was some poor little country that was being attacked by some big country, and the Romans would come and defend them, And then suddenly it always ended up that country became Rome's country, because they were ungrateful frequently, those countries, to Rome, and then Rome had to suppress them, you see. After Rome did that, Rome enforced gratitude, you can say, and Rome became somehow, by this policy of perfectly legal alliances, the master of the world. Amazing, how their morality, their wonderful morality and good behavior led them to the mastery and domination of the world. But what was it in particular about the Romans? And this is, in this translation, spelling one's page 17. They have foresight, and here he makes a comparison to medicine, and this becomes in a way his model. One thing that's always the same, by the way, is medicine. Some politics seems to change from time to time, but medicine is the same. And medicine, the good doctor looks ahead and applies the cure now, as you are painfully aware. What's the difference between Louis or the moderns altogether? What were the Romans? You see, and here you see he uses this as the occasion to mention a fundamental principle. The Romans always were ready to make war. The moderns are not ready to make war. Somehow, modernity, although there's a lot of war in modernity, the moderns talk too much about peace or try to avoid war too much. Nor did they ever do what is constantly on the lips of our wise men. And this is, he talks about our wise men. Our wise men enjoyed the benefits of the present time, but rather they enjoyed the benefits of their virtue and prudence, for time brings out everything. It can bring it with it as good as well as the bad, and the bad as well as the good. So what is the essential thing here, as I can see it? The characteristic of modern times is the attempt to avoid war, not to foresee, you can say lack of foresight, and foresight means to say is connected with readiness for war. So he's beginning to characterize modern times. So he's giving a kind of education. And modern times are not warlike enough. Now, he goes through that's the mistakes that Louis made. What were the essential mistakes that Louis made? The most essential, he lists 5 of them. He didn't do all those things the Romans did. And among those things, by the way, begins for the first time the discussion of the church. He made the church powerful. But after having gone through this whole list, 2 pages from the end of the chapter, he makes a general statement in the first place. The desire to acquire is truly a very natural and ordinary thing. And wherever men who can do so, they are praised and not condemned. But when they cannot and want to do so just the same, herein lies the mistake and the condemnation. Now, it's very important to see this principle. he says men always want to acquire more. That's perfectly sensible. I mean, that's probably true. But then, I mean, that's what Aristotle said too. Desire is infinite. But what did Aristotle say? You should limit desire. Machiavelli says, no, don't limit desire. Or at least he says he doesn't try to limit desire. The old purpose of philosophy was that boring thing, for political philosophy, moral philosophy, don't have extreme desires, limit yourself. Here Machiavelli says, no, I don't care about that. The important thing is whether you succeed at it. So here you see a fantastic transformation. Now the question is why a decent man, if he is a decent man, would make that transformation. We won't even go into that, but here a moral orientation already changes. All he's saying is the important thing is to succeed, and if you don't succeed, then you're to be blamed. And the issue is praise and blame, not good and bad, but praise and blame. There's a certain relationship between praise and blame and good and bad, but not an one-to-one relationship between praise and blame. And so you can say Machiavelli emancipates the desire to acquire. The old role of philosophy as a moderator of men disappears, and he hasn't explained why, but he just does. He talks as a kind of accomplice of the prince. You see, it's one thing. A philosopher has to be a king if the philosopher is a teacher of moderation. But if the philosopher is a teacher of conquest, then he doesn't have to be a king. He can just be the king's advisor because he doesn't have to change the king in the fundamental way. But then he goes on. Louis therefore had made these 5 mistakes. He had extinguished the weaker powers, increased the power in Italy of a powerful force, that's the church, brought into that country a most powerful foreigner, that's the Spaniards, did not come to live in Italy, did not bring in colonies. Nevertheless, these mistakes, if he had lived, might not have hurt him. You see, what appeared to be the fundamental errors suddenly aren't the fundamental errors. He made a further error. For if he had not made the church powerful, if he had lived, might not have hurt him. If he had not made a 6th, that of depriving the Venetians of their power. For if he had not made the church powerful, nor brought Spain into Italy, it would have been most sensible and necessary to put down the Venetians. But having taken those first steps, he should never have allowed them to be ruined. For while they remained powerful, they always would have kept the others from attempting to take Lombardy. You see, Lombardy, you're getting a view of the problems of Italy. A lot of small principalities and republics with the church having some kind of power, and then France and Spain wishing to come in. Louis, so it's a very complicated omelet if we'll just work out the politics of it. Now, Louis came in, as you can see, at the church's behest. And that was very advantageous to him. But then he made the final mistake of knocking down the Venetians, who were a powerful force. And when the Venetians were gone, of course, then the Pope no longer had to fear the alliance, the hostility of the Venetians, and could then attack Louis. So you can see, of course, the church is the great benefiter from this. But what does he say? But having taken those first steps, he should never have allowed them to be ruined. For while they remained powerful, they always would have kept the others from attempting, and so on. And then he says, and if someone were to say, King Louis surrendered Romagna to Alexander VI, and the kingdom of Naples to Spain in order to avoid going to war, I would answer with the arguments expressed above, that one must never permit disorder to develop in order to avoid going to war. So there's one thing, perhaps fear of war. And the second one, if some others were to cite the promise that the king had made the Pope to undertake that enterprise in exchange for the annulment of his marriage and the cardinal's hat of Rouen, I would answer what I shall say further on concerning the promise of it's the faith of princes and how it should be observed. Now, what was his crucial error then? Not all those other things, but keeping faith with the Pope. Why did he keep faith with the Pope? You see, do you want to say?
I suspect because he was a Christian.
Yeah. Not a very good Christian in the sense that he didn't like worldly things, but he was probably, but certainly in order to get an annulment of his marriage, he wasn't willing to do what Henry VIII did. He's an ordinary sinner, but he still is a believer. Now, what's Machiavelli's suggestion? Not that he become a good man or a good Christian, but the suggestion is that he should become a less good Christian. What's the difference between Rome? I mean, why did the Romans succeed and Louis XII not? Because the Romans didn't have Christian consciences. And because they put a primacy on war, of course Christianity, of course, was the religion of peace. My suggestion is that the real difference between ancients and moderns is the difference between Christian and pagan in the first place. And that Machiavelli is beginning to suggest, as you'll see, all the good models are the ancient models, that the real problem is the church. Perhaps even more than a church, but in this case, I mean, it's the practical presence of the church. It is Alexander VI and the activities of the church. See, what's the difference between, Rome was Italy too, but what's the change? Something new that came into the world that changed the orientation of men towards peace on the one hand, and also to a certain faith among themselves and certainly to the power of the Pope. And he's going to later discuss the character of the church once it's developed. But you see, in a hidden way, what's gradually coming to the fore is that it is destructive of politics that the moderns are weak because of certain opinions they hold, more than anything else. And those opinions have something to do with that new revealed religion. That would be my suggestion.
You're really implying that there is a distinction between pagan ethics and Christian ethics, or between pagan practice and Christian practice? Because certainly Aristotle, for instance, would not favor war as Roman practice would, nor would just Rome.
Yeah, good point. That's the reason why, of course, Machiavelli's break is very radical.
Seems to break with paganism as well.
And paganism probably would not be the proper term to use. You say it's more an imitation of ancient practice. You see, it's ancient practice versus ancient theory. You see, I mean, it's not. No. That's the difference. Ancient theory did not have the same effect on ancient practice. That's ultimately, the Romans won't be the final highest ideal, but somehow or other, Christianity, which may have been connected with, or at least have a kinship with ancient theory, had more of an effect on statesmen, on the consciousness of statesmen. Now, I think he would argue, but we don't have to get into this now, that there is a considerable difference between ancient philosophical morality and modern, biblical revelational morality. But nevertheless, you can see he has to transform the whole moral tradition. That's the reason why he's so radical. At this point, that distinction between theory and practice isn't here. We have modern practice and ancient practice. What's the difference between ancient and modern practice? I'm suggesting that it's becoming fairly clear it's somehow connected with the church, and keeping faith, and so on. You can see that has something to do with the universal church. You see, the whole question that Louis was not the high priest of his country. The kind of problem that Henry VIII discussed. But it goes further than that. I mean, we'll just say it at this point that this sinner, Louis, obviously had some fear of hellfire, or at least the power of the Pope. I mean, perhaps excommunication wouldn't have bothered him from the point of view of the salvation of his soul, but certainly his people would not have, would have caused him trouble. That's that there was a power, a new kind of power in the world connected with the church, and that's what's perfectly clear here in this passage. And the two great problems, you see, although he goes into all these practical things, two things that emerge are, on the one hand, the primacy of peace, and on the conscience, the moral conscience of the rulers who aren't able to do what's necessary to rule. And he tells this little story in the end that sounds like name-dropping, but clearly it's not. That he had a discussion with Rohan, the man who was involved in the Louis XII's mistake, and also whom in chapter 7 Machiavelli should have been made pope. And Rohan tells him the Italians don't understand war. And Machiavelli responds to him, the French had no understanding of politics. And what's their lack of understanding of politics? They would not allow. They would now allow the church to gain so much power. This is a marvelous conversation to carry on with a cardinal. There's considerable humor in the. This is a very decisive chapter, as you can see, in gradually. If you read this chapter over quickly the first time, it just looks like a big bore with a lot of, details and general rules. But you see what's emerging here. The ancients and moderns dispute. I realize I'm back in the United States. They're really keeping the places cold now, aren't they?
Well, this room is old.
Well, that was fine this spring. It's shooting out cold air here.
Yeah, right. That's right down your neck.
This will harden us up in the good Roman virtue. So I want to go quickly through chapters 4 and 5 and get to 6, because we're not going to have time to go through in the way in which I'd like. But you see, these details are so beautiful, and as much time as you can possibly spend with the students on this, because it precisely is the detailed understanding, because he very rarely teaches in general maxims, and his general maxims are not usually his real teaching. I mean, and the reason why he's teaching this way, a variety of things. Of course, the power of the church was very great, and most men were, believers in a rather stricter sense than they are today, but also because of a certain... now, chapter 4 is a strange interlude. Why the kingdom of Darius, which was occupied by Alexander, did not, after the death of Alexander, rebel against his successors. Now, I'll just give a quick outline, to teach this, because I would like to cover every chapter of the Prince, because it ties together in a web. And that seems irrelevant, but what is it about? It's about the conquest, about holding on to conquests. And since you can say the ultimate discussion here seems to be about conquests, he reveals, a certain problem. My suggestion is, of course, he's really speaking, using it as a kind of test case. Italy, the problem of holding Italy. He says, now there are some countries that are very difficult to conquer, but very easy to hold on to, and some countries that are very difficult to hold on to. Very easy to hold on to, but very difficult to conquer. The ones that are very easy to conquer are ones like France, which have a tremendous variety of small fiefdoms, small representatives. So all you have to, they're not likely to follow the king with great loyalty and so on. But they're very, very difficult to hold on to, precisely because they really have a spirit of independence, decentralized independence and so on. very easy, so they're easy to conquer but very hard to hold on to. Very difficult to conquer are things like the Turks. Why? Because everybody who's in power, under the Turkish Sultan, holds the power from the king or from the Sultan, and they know perfectly well that once they're out, they're out. That it's that their loyalty is not like the loyalty of a congressman to a president, but like the loyalty of a cabinet member or even more, a member of the White House staff. The loyalty, I think you can see the difference that existed, say, during Watergate between those two kinds, because they had separate bases of power. Which is Italy more like? My suggestion is Italy is like both. It's full of small republics and principalities. In a way, it makes it easy to conquer but hard to hold on to. But what is it that is like the Sultan, that has people who are loyal to it? The Pope, the Church, and he later compares in chapter 20. Is it 25? I'm not sure. 21. I'm not sure. I'll show it to you when we get there. The Church and its organization to the Sultan, to the Turks. That Italy poses an almost impossible problem. You see, in chapter 5, he deals with that question of independent republics. He doesn't deal with the question of the church. Italy is difficult to be easy to hold on to once the church were conquered, but the attachment to the church, whether he means the Pope or whatever, is hard to say. But in chapter 5, he tells you what you have to do to cities that were independent previously. And what does he say? It's really the first really brutal teaching, truly brutal. He says they have to be destroyed simply. No, that's a harsh teaching, and in some sense it's overstated. He talks about the Romans being the only ones who were really tough enough to do it. But of course that probably is true of the foundings of great nations, that the old have to be destroyed. Of course we've had a little too much of that in modern times to swallow it very easily. But the point is, this of course ends up in a praise of republics. That has to be recognized, that Machiavelli is talking about the foundations, but he doesn't mean to say that principalities are the best. What does he say? In the case of republics, there is greater life, greater hatred, more desire for revenge. The memory of their ancient liberty will not and cannot allow them to rest. So that the surest way to destroy them, surest way is to destroy them or take up residence there. That's the last sentence of chapter 5. That's a praise of republics. It's important to remember that if Machiavelli, as I suggest in a way, is discussing the foundations of regimes, you have to do brutal things, but maybe one of the things, and you have to have princes in order to do it, but perhaps what you would want to do is establish republics. Now, we turn to chapter 6, which is the great. He's prepared us, you see, and we're at all new principalities, just by means of one's own arms and one's own virtue. Virtue is a terribly important word to keep using here. The students will, say, along with the translators, you shouldn't read virtue. It means the Renaissance idea of virtue, which is courage or something like that, or cleverness. That's all a lot of hogwash. The word virtue, he uses the word virtue is virtue. Now the question is what the content of virtue is. Machiavelli moves between a new interpretation of virtue and the old one. Sometimes he uses virtue as chastity. Sometimes he uses virtue as killing somebody. And it only becomes alive as he uses it, because he's showing, he's making a real transvaluation of values, a real transformation of moral things. And so here this is the first chapter that touches on his greatest theme. And what is his greatest theme? The founders of new modes and orders, he calls it. And he said, and he takes the greatest possible heroes and you see the extent of his theoretical and perhaps practical ambition. The greatest founders, I mean, those kinds of changes, like, between Christianity and paganism, the founding of the Persian Empire, the real transformations that just change a whole world where everything is changed. And essentially it's foundations of, things that are probably connected with religions. He takes 4 great heroes, and it's important to realize they are all pre-Christian. Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus. Of the things God had commanded him. He still should be admired, if only for that grace which made him worthy of speaking with God. Which, he's being very pious. He includes Moses among the list of the great founders. But let us consider Cyrus and others who acquired or founded kingdoms. You will find them all admirable, and if their particular actions and institutions are examined, they do not appear to differ from those of Moses, who had so great a preceptor. So the point is, a purely human understanding, you don't really need that great preceptor in order to do what Moses did. That's the first, obviously kind of blasphemy, but done with very, with very considerable grace, as Machiavelli does. And then Machiavelli is the person who is telling the real way of being a founder. So what does that mean to say about what he's doing? He is taking the place of that other great preceptor. I think you will find that the Bible does not tell you very much about the kinds of things Machiavelli tells you about. But since Machiavelli says these are the things you have to know, what is Machiavelli suggesting? A kind of new Bible. What?
You got it.
This is his. Well, the extent. You see, there has been an attempt in recent years, as people try to make everybody else conventional, to say that Machiavelli was really a conventional believer, but who dealt only with politics. I believe that's impossible if you look at it with any care. It's incidentally, the very terms of using one's own arms and one's own virtue. I mean, I believe that that's an unchristian disposition. One isn't supposed to rely on oneself. One's supposed to rely on God. So far as I understand, if I'm correct. It's that this is not humility. That one deals with the arms of God. Savonarola, whom he refers to here, by the way, constantly spoke about the vanity of one's own virtue and so on, the sinfulness, Now, the problem of these new foundations, he states it very clearly, is this. There is nothing more difficult to carry out, nor more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to manage than to introduce a new system of things. For the introducer has as his enemies all those who benefit from the old system, from the old order. I think it's important to use that language. The old order, modes and orders, the old order. And lukewarm defenders, and all those who would benefit by the new order. See, you have the contented, you see, since he's suggesting a whole world in which new religions come about, I think you have to say he's in a way suggesting a new religion. And there are those who are satisfied with the old religion, and then what about those who don't like the old religion? They are lukewarm because they are afraid of their adversaries who have the law on their side and partly from the incredulousness of men in general, who do not really believe something new unless they actually have had experience with it. Therefore it happens that whenever those who are enemies have the occasion to attack, they do so with the fervor of partisans, and those others come to the defense lukewarmly, so that both the prince and his friends are in danger. So great foundations are very difficult. Now, Machiavelli is very silent in this chapter about what Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus did. You'll see it. But what he puts, but he does give this general formula, which is one of the most famous formulas in the Prince. Unarmed prophets always fail. And because you have to be able to compel belief, as he says. People are unstable, and it's easy to persuade them of something, but difficult to hold them to that persuasion. You see, and he's already, in a way, you can say, doubting the power of faith as being sufficient, a purely spiritual power, asking for something more. And he takes as an example of an unarmed prophet, Savonarola. I believe, if you reflect on it, that he could have gone to more fundamental examples. What I mean to say is, obviously Jesus was an unarmed prophet. You take Savonarola, who was an unarmed prophet. But then that raises the whole question, can you really have considered that Jesus was a failure, even from his own terms, within his own terms? What he does is he takes ancient examples, and one biblical example, but pre-Christian, and praises them very highly, then attacks unarmed prophets. I mean, it's perfectly clear that that is an attack on Christianity. Now the question is, how does he understand Christianity? I mean, obviously, in some sense, he has to regard it as a failure. And I suppose the way in which he regards it as a failure is, well, look at modern politics and its lack of success. It's, the smallness and pettiness and the viciousness of these states. But I don't want to, but at the same time, how could he understand Jesus? I mean, there are a very great variety of alternatives, and I will not pursue them here. He's going to have to come up, I'll come to it later. And one is that that Christianity really succeeded because of the failure of Rome. Another is that Christianity did succeed in one way, but it succeeded with the wrong teaching, and therefore, although Machiavelli, what about Machiavelli himself? He's a teacher, he's a prophet, in this case, a founder. He's not got arms. Isn't he more like Jesus? I'll just leave those as open questions for the moment. And then he ends with what a great guy Hero was, who was a much lower person, much lower figure. And that's going to be, you have to watch for that to come back again, as usual, because then he says Hero is just like Moses and Romulus and Theseus, and then he's not going to tell you much about Romulus, Moses, and Theseus, but he is going to tell you some more about Hero. And since they're the same as the others, once you learn about Hero, you'll learn about Moses, Romulus, and Theseus. This is Machiavelli's way of teaching. I'll go quickly through chapter 7, and then we'll break, yeah. Chapter 7 is about Cesare Borgia. And it's usually understood that Cesare Borgia is Cesare Borgia is Machiavelli's hero. I do not believe that to be the case, although he's obviously a man of very great capacities, and I'll show you the reasons why. This is another long chapter. This is a story of a failure. And the others are stories of successes, and it's important to recognize. You see, well, how did it move, the book? From chapters 1 through 6, there was an ascent upward to the highest cases, the greatest founders. All new, greatest founders. A descent begins to occur here. Here we have somebody who didn't do it by his own virtue, and who failed, who had great virtues, but who got it through fortune. Now, it's no accident that this is a modern example, and it's also no accident that it's the son of a pope. And in a way, you have the core of the teaching right there, that the problem somehow is in the pope. And he actually here compares him to Francesco Sforza, and Francesco Sforza, I believe you'll see, is actually a better case. I mean, a better case in the sense he did it on his own and he succeeded, yeah. No, I hope I can find that. There was one sentence that I wanted to show you. But what does he mean by fortune in this chapter? This is the first discussion of fortune. The others did it by virtue. He doesn't say what their virtue was. But what does he mean by fortune here?
The help of others happens to have been.
Yeah, on one side, it surely seems to be just, that you got it from others. I wonder whether it doesn't broaden out to something much more. I'll give you an example of what I mean in a minute. Yeah, fortune just seems to be, very, very practically, that you got it from somebody else. It's his father. But his father, of course, is the Pope, and the question is, what's the relationship between the Pope and fortune? Yeah, but I just want to see quickly if I can find one sentence. Excuse me. It was not his own fault, but rather the result of an extraordinary and extreme malignity of fortune. Have you seen that sentence before?
In chapter 1.
Yeah. Malignità di Fortuna. It's like Machiavelli himself. The end, not the first chapter, the ending of the Epistle Dedicatory. Those are the last words of the Epistle Dedicatory.
Where is that sentence? In paragraph 2.
At the end of paragraph 2 of chapter 7. I cannot find the line here. I can't find the line. I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, on page 63. Here we have of this edition, 62. It's in the last paragraph of the whole chapter. He says he had done everything. He said, but it's important he said, in innovating with new modes the old orders. You see, in chapter 2, you see he uses these terms which are neutral, and you have to give meanings to them. You see, and of course translators don't come across with this. There were founders, Moses, Romulus, Cyrus, and Theseus were founders of new modes and orders. He doesn't say what that means. Here he gives you, he says, now what is really his error? Not error, what is it that makes Cesare of a lower order, even if he had succeeded? He brought new modes, new ways of ruling to old orders. But the problem is the old order. What is the old order? The old order is, I believe, the old religion. But I don't want to go through the details, although it's very interesting. I mean, he has really wonderful stories about the way in which he operates and so on. But he seems to have very bad luck. He himself gets physically sick, and his father is dying. But his father is the Pope. Now, the question is, can it be really understood to be a simple act of fortune that his father was dying? At least simple act of fortune. Machiavelli later says, and you can figure it out, but he later says it directly, the average rule of a pope was 8 years. So that's not an act of fortune. It was perfectly natural. And because he depended upon the church for his power, what's the problem? The church, no hereditary succession. See, and new popes have different, you see, what does this all end up to? Everything he did profited the church. Julius II, not himself, he failed. It profited the church. He didn't really establish a new thing because he was dependent essentially on the church. But in one sense, you can't say that this is an act of fortune that his father was dying, just simple bad luck. It could have been predicted. But the question is whether the church itself and its mode of political organization is properly political. But you see, he talks about all the things he did, but then he says he made one mistake, and that only comes out in the last paragraph. What was the mistake? One mistake, only one mistake. You see, so he did make a mistake. But the question is whether this is not what was the mistake?
Creation of Julius II.
He chose the wrong man pope. He should have chosen Rohan or Spain. But why did he choose the wrong man pope? You can say that's just an error of judgment, and that's typical. But what was his real mistake? It's not just choosing the wrong man pope. Why did he choose the wrong man pope? He didn't understand something.
Nobody else would guess.
What did he expect? He'd done a small damage, but then he gave Rohan a very great benefaction, the papacy. What did he expect?
He expected that he'd have a friend.
He expected gratitude. He counted on virtue. He counted on there were remains of a certain kind of Christian faith in him, as it were, almost, faith in virtue. That even Cesare Borgia, and he really goes through this thing, had a kind of, wasn't morally harsh enough. And that's the real error. And if you notice, it's a very strange passage. Here you have the son of a spiritual father. And he keeps this only time he refers to Julius II in this way. He calls him San Pietro, San Pietro, San Pietro several times. San Pietro ad vinculum. Here you find the son of a spiritual father who turned over his realm to somebody named Peter and was betrayed by him. At least this is a Machiavelli interpretation, sort of a double story. Yeah? So you see, in a way, what you learn is that you have to have a much greater purgation of the ordinary moral dispositions of men in ordinary kind of states of life. And on the other hand, that the real fortuna, or reliance on fortune, is somehow the reliance on the church in Italy. That really begins to be much more the center of the problem. You realize this. by this conjunction of chapters 6 and 7. Can we leave it at that point? It's exciting, isn't it? Isn't it a story the way you
Significant for he says not modest,
chapter 8, excuse me. No, it's a very funny chapter. I'm giggling. It comes as a surprise because it is the only one. It's the first one that introduces a new category. You see, previously there were two ways of getting to be a prince. One was by fortune, and the other was by virtue. And suddenly, a new category: princes who have become princes by wickedness, which doesn't fit. So, a new moral horizon is open to one. If one wants to be a prince, it's possible to do it by way of wickedness. That really is a shock. And we meet two people here, Oliveretto da Fermo and Agathocles, ancient and modern. The ancient succeeded and the modern failed. That's just going to now will no longer come as a surprise to you. The biggest villain of the two is Agathocles of Syracuse. And Agathocles, it's one of the things, the name means famous for being good, yeah? I'm not sure that was his motive in choosing him. Now, the issue is this: he says that he shouldn't overlook that, and he speaks in terms of very great moralism. It's a terrible thing to do this, but in order to be complete, I have to mention it, yeah? What he says is Agathocles came from nowhere and on his own basis, worked his way up, had killed all the senators and so on, and managed to maintain himself. And then he goes into a description of Agathocles. Whoever examines, therefore, the actions and life of this man will find nothing or very little that can be attributed to fortune. For as was said above, not with the help of others, but by advancing in the military ranks, which involved 1,000 hardships and dangers, he came to rule the principality, which he then managed to maintain by many courageous and dangerous efforts. Yet it cannot be called, this man translates ingenuity, but it's virtue, to kill one's fellow citizens, betray friends, be without faith, without pity, without religion. All of these may bring one to power, but not to imperium, to empire, but not to glory. Now, that's, of course, an interesting reflection to make in the first place. The difference is that you can't get glory this way. You can succeed, but you can't get glory by these means. Now, later he's going to make it, well, of course, you see, glory isn't in the nature of the thing. If one is unjust, that makes a bad soul, or it gives you piles or whatever, that's a real punishment. But there's glory as such is not intrinsic, to the activity of virtue. Now, and he in a way admits that glory is the goal. But of course, empire is a goal too. And if you can't have empire, why not? If you can't have glory, why not have empire rather than have nothing? But then later, he's going to suggest with another man who does the same things that it's possible to get glory But here, it's only the epitaph that's different from that of the greatest man. But then he goes on to say, for if one were to consider the virtue of Agathocles in facing and surviving danger in his courageous spirit, of getting into and getting out of dangers, and the greatness of his soul, one will see that he's not inferior to any of the most excellent captains. And he said, nevertheless, his cruelty and humanity, with his infinite wickedness, can't allow him to be placed among the most excellent men. Now, look at this passage. For the use of virtue, he says you can't call it virtue to do such and such and such and such. To kill, to betray. And then in the very next line, he says, if one looks at the great virtues of Agathocles, see, two senses of virtue put right together. You see, anyway, he's contrasting a kind of, you could say, Christian or traditional moral virtue versus another kind of virtue, you see, in this same man. And then he says he belongs among the most excellent captains, but he can't be called among the most excellent men because of his cruelty and humanity together with his infinite wickedness. No, this is very funny because, okay, but see the way he's playing with this awful man. Look at the wonderful things he did, and he talks about the greatness of his soul. I think it's one of the few places he uses soul in the in the whole book. And he knew what he was talking about with soul. The man had a great soul. Then he turns to this Oliveretto de Fermo, who didn't get away with it all. What was Oliveretto was destroyed by who? By who? Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia was the son of the Pope. We're back to the church. What was Oliveretto's trouble? I mean, Oliveretto, it was absolutely a stinker in every way. Killed his own, relatives and so on, just to get cheap power. But what was his mistake? He trusted Cesare Borgia. He had too much faith. This is the whole model. He takes these wickedest people you could possibly imagine and attacks them for having faith. Yeah, this is the Machiavelli's way. And then the last sentence of the second of the third to last paragraph. The last sentence of the passage on this Oliveretto, this modern, he says he was where he too was captured with Vitellozzo, his teacher in virtue and wickedness. Of course, they don't. You usually hear they translated strategy. Again, his teacher in virtue. He was strangled by his teacher in virtue. Now, what's the effect of this? You see, he's starting. You see, if the goal is political success, then the question is, and one can succeed by wickedness, then what is the moral badness of wickedness? Now that isn't, and is it fundamentally distinguishable from, or put it this way, aren't the so-called virtues, like the virtues of faith, trustworthiness, and so on, destructive of what's political? Whether Agathocles doesn't come out looking very good from this, perhaps even better than Cesare Borgia. And here he goes on to say, this whole chapter is very funny. It really is at a level of pride. One might question how Agathocles and other like him, after so many treacheries and cruelties, could live for so long a time secure in their country and defend themselves from outside enemies without being conspired against by their own citizens, while many others, because of their cruelty, were unable even in time of peace to hold their power, not to mention the unstable times of war. I believe this depends on cruelty being well or badly used. He's introducing a new set of moral distinctions. Good and bad cruelty. Yeah, this is. Those cruelties can be considered well used if it is permissible to say good about bad. Yeah, se del male è licito dire bene. Yeah, that are performed all at once, in order to assure one's position, and are not continued, but rather turned to the greatest advantage possible for the subjects. Badly used are those cruelties that, although at first they are few, increase with time rather than disappear. Now here is the great sentence. Those who observe the first way can remedy their position with God and with man, as Agathocles did. Now how does he know what Agathocles did with God? He speaks for it. Because, you see, Agathocles was this horrible man, a liar, a cheat, a murderer, a usurper, a tyrant, and so on. But because of his using cruelty well, he bettered his position with God. Machiavelli announces this is the the evangelism, the announcement of good news, by Machiavelli, his promise of salvation. So as you see, this new category already begins to indicate the breakdown of the ordinary moral distinctions. I mean, I think you can put it this way. But Machiavelli says, all right, let's look at politics practically. We're going to begin, dealing with Italy. Then you deal with Italy and you realize there's something wrong with Italy. Things don't get done right, yeah. And then you realize, then you look at you look back, I read a few books about the ancients, things didn't happen that way. What's the problem? Well, on one hand, it's the church, perhaps connected with that there's a certain kind of morality that makes it impossible to establish solid regimes. Therefore, just beginning from ordinary practical politics, like a journalist or something like that, you are forced to reflect on the general problem of morality. See, and here's where this question of alienation will start coming about. I mean, I use that term, so I take it from Rousseau, but the split between the necessities of two worlds. And then the question is whether one must not make a choice between those two worlds. So something like that. That's the gradual movement of the book, beginning from politics. Now, chapter 9 I'm going to move through these chapters rather quickly, although, I mean, there's a gradual development. In chapter 9 is in certain ways one of the most significant moments in the history of political philosophy, this little chapter. It is the first discussion, or you can say the first argument, I believe, in favor of the fundamental principle of democracy. Although, I'll have to show you the way in which that occurs in this very, very modest form. Let me say that in the whole history of political philosophy up to Machiavelli, I believe there was no theoretical man who was in favor of democracy. And that's important to recognize it. Everybody today is in favor of democracy, and one has to understand why that was the case. You see, the ancient argument was simply that the majority are the poor, and the poor are the ignorant, and therefore it means government by the ignorant. That would be one way of putting it. The other way of putting it would be, of course, that the purpose of civil society is the good life, therefore it has to be encourage the best men. The best men are rare, therefore aristocracy should be the principle. Something like that. Now, this chapter begins with, again, another kind of principality, somebody who's elected, who rises to power, was chosen by the people one way or the other. And then the question is, by whom is one chosen? And he divides the country up into two parts, the nobles and the common people. By whom is it better to rise, and to whom should one be dedicated? And whom should one rest one's power, the people or the nobles? Now, why should the prince, or put this question, who should the prince rest himself on? Who's better to rise by? The answer is very simply and straightforwardly the common people. which is a kind of Caesarian policy. Why would a prince prefer to rise by the common people? There was a certain review, that the aristocrats should stick together, take care of their position. What's the reason for resting oneself on the people?
The rivals.
No,
Grateful.
Yeah, well, more grateful because less powerful. Yeah, there aren't people. The common people won't say, "On what meat doth this Caesar feed?" That he doth bestrive the world, the universe like a colossus. Not that rivalry of the senatorial class. A prince has an interest in the common people because the common people are likely to be his. To accept him more easily. Another way of formulating, so you can say that the prince should have a preference for the people, on the grounds of sheer stability, or maintenance of his rule, and that's an important state. But there's the next stage. What is it? All men have great desires. All men have great desires. But the rich or the nobles, of course, want to hurt others because they already have enough to take care of themselves, whereas the ordinary and the common people only want not to be aggressed against. Now, if everybody is selfish, then the person who has modest selfish desires is well, if you just take from that perspective, somehow morally superior. I think it's not very moral, but if you take a poor man and make him rich, then he's obviously going to be an aggressive rich man. But as long as he's poor, all he really wants is not to have harm done to him rather than to do harm. So, if you take the position that all men are fundamentally selfishly motivated, then there is a certain predisposition in favor of the moral teaching, or that the people, or that democracy is more legitimate. If there are no such things as, fundamental virtues, or certainly any virtues of any political class, now Machiavelli takes over where everybody begins where everybody begins. That there is at least a fundamental schism within political society between the rich and the poor. But what Plato and Aristotle would say is, of course, the rich have opportunity to develop certain virtues, and therefore you could, in principle, develop a regime that is based on public spiritedness, caring for the common good. But if everybody's naturally selfish, then, of course, there's no moral reason for supporting, the well-to-do. And then there is the practical reason of stability for supporting them. Another way, another formulation, let's see, of the same thing is Machiavelli has gradually, thus far, destroyed the moral basis of rule. I mean, why do we trust our rulers? Why we're supposed to? Well, because they're supposed to be good men and who are virtuous. Everybody gets up, when he's running, I have a good family life. I never stole any money. I'm devoted to public service. I love my country. Well, Machiavelli's gradually called that into question, both as a possible or a desirable motive. So now he's making another suggestion. There are two kinds of people, or three kinds of people. There are the aristocrats, who want all they can get, There's the poor who want protection, and then there's the man who wants glory. You see a marvelous harmony possible, a harmony of self-interest. The poor should put themselves in the hands of a man who wants glory. Because how do you get glory? You get glory from the people. The man will take care of the people in order to get that glory. If you take those two human types, then how shall I say, then there is, in selfishness, a public good can come out of being selfish. And that would be a much solider public good than trying to concentrate on, some of the things that are so fragile as going against your own self-interest, or getting people who are virtuous. The only thing that gets cut out is the aristocratic class. This is the first fundamental argument in favor of the people, and it's very important to recognize that it comes in this context of stability, even of tyranny. You see, it very rapidly transforms itself in Hobbes. Civil society is the association of the threatened and the weak, which puts themselves together under a sovereign for protection. And that's the purpose of civil society. And then you either have to get rid of those who think they're strong or try to convince them they too are the weak or something like that. But this is a really gradual transformation in the orientation based upon, at this point, the tacit point of view that there is no aristocratic class that can be truly called aristocracy. For example, when you get to Locke, you'll see very quickly he makes three distinctions between regimes: democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy. That distinction between good and bad that gave 6 for Aristotle has disappeared. You can say a substitute for morality is found in chapter 9. This isn't the end of the story, it goes further than this, but a substitute for morality in enlightened self-interest occurs. These two fundamental types of human beings, the glory-seeking man on the one hand, and the security-seeking mass on the other, opposing the rapaciousness of the aristocratic, or you would say he breaks down the distinction between aristocracy and oligarchy in chapter 9. Now, that essentially seems to finish the discussion of the regimes, but in chapter 10 seems to start something new, but we'll return to that.
Could I ask just one question?
Yeah, sure.
Chapter 9, you opened it by saying sort of like the idea of the first statement of democracy.
Or the principle underlying democracy is a fundamental defense of the people as the grounds on which the polity should be based, on the weak, on the selfish desire for preservation. That's what I mean to say.
Mm-hmm. But the thing I find lacking, of course, is the notion of sort of the rights of man.
Oh no, that comes. You see, it's this change in orientation. At least Hobbes very quickly then transforms that into a teaching. Everybody has a right to self-preservation, and that should be the goal. But that is that. You see, but it comes from this. You can say neglect or denial of the fact that, or of the notion that virtue is the goal of politics, that there is an aristocratic class which as such can be directed towards virtue, towards the common good. He says he's doing something new here. The people become that on which the prince should rest himself. And of course there are 2 or 3 steps to the transformation to a truly democratic theory. I say it's capital as a stage. Machiavelli did not present the natural rights teaching. There's no natural right teaching present in Machiavelli. what he did is he made the moral transformation, he made the fundamental critique of the ancient notion, suggested a project which was filled in by the others. That's what I'm trying to present. And I'm doing this stage by stage, so it'll become much clearer, I think, when you reach chapters 15 and 25. But it only takes on its flesh when you read each each stage of chapter. Chapter 10 I'll skip over very quickly, saying that he gives that as a measuring rod. Of the strength of a principality, and that measuring rod is how big is it? The armies are, very, very simply. I won't say anything more than that about that chapter at this moment. And then, now there only remain to be discussed the ecclesiastical principalities, concerning which all the difficulties occur before they are possessed. For they are acquired either through virtue or fortune, and maintained without either. For they are maintained through the ancient ordinances of religion. What it says is the ancient orders of religion. That will keep you no connection with chapter 7, chapter 6, which are so powerful and of such quality that they keep their princes in power no matter how they carry on and conduct their lives. These are the only princes that possess states and do not defend them, that possess subjects and do not govern them. And the states, by remaining undefended, are not taken from them. And the subjects, by not being governed, do not mind it. And they do not hope, nor are they able to break their ties with them. These princes, then, are the only safe and happy ones. But since they are supported by superior causes that the human mind is unable to rise to, I shall not speak about them, for exalted and maintained as they are by God, to discuss them would be the task of a presumptuous and a foolhardy man. However, someone might ask how the church is going to temporal power, and of course the laugh isn't that. He says he won't discuss it. It's like what's with Moses Mondimanco. He goes on to talk about it. Obviously, this first passage is written with what one might call great indignation. The church, the states of the church do not govern. There is no real justice. They are prey to foreign enemies constantly. They're the peak of weakness. And so it was clearly an attack on the church. You see, and here's where he says the short lives of the popes was the cause of, in 10 years, the average lifespan of a pope. You see, he made it perfectly clear, you see, what I mentioned in chapter 7. Now, he talks about Alexander the Sixth as the man who gave the Pope, the church, its temporal power. And you see, what's the problem here? The church has had a kind of power. You can't deny that it has a kind of power because it's there, a power in men's belief. But it's not powerful enough, the beliefs are not powerful enough to make men behave well. But the beliefs are powerful enough not to keep them from being able to behave badly enough to have good political orders. It's a perfect halfway house that doesn't solve either of the extremes. And then he makes it clear in a way the whole history of the book. If you remember, we begin in chapter 3 with Louis XII coming in. Then we learn, to Italy and getting into trouble. Then we learn in chapter 7 that it really wasn't Louis XII, that he was attracted in by Cesare. He was just a tool in order to get the Romagna. And now, you see, as you gradually get into the hidden story, what does he say? Then there arose to power Alexander VI, who more than any other pope demonstrated how much a pope with money and arms could prevail, and he achieved with Duke Valentino as his means, and the coming of the French as his occasion, all those things I mentioned previously when discussing the actions of the Duke. So what's the point? The real hero or villain is Alexander VI. And you see, you've gradually been, it's like a kind of indoctrination course. First you saw Louis II from his perspective, then you saw Cesare Borgia, and you realize it was Alexander VI who is truly the model of a Renaissance prince, who with power and money. But of course the problem is that the church is everything he tried to do for himself and for his own sort of natural motivations for his own children always redounded to the power of the church, and the church had different goals. So you can say the problem of solving Italian politics is the problem of the church. And he ends it, now His Holiness Pope Leo has found the papacy extremely powerful, and we hope that just as those before him made it great by means of arms, he through his goodness and infinite other virtues will make it great and worthy of reverence. I'll just mention that because he refers to that, parodies that sentence later. That's the end of, you can say, in a way, the book should be done now. And of course, ecclesiastical principalities, you see, by the way it's placed, are kind of, as I say, in a limbo that doesn't fit ordinary politics, that wouldn't have existed in antiquity, and somehow or other we're going to have to get a explanation of what that power is. My suggestion is, of course, it's in the beliefs of men, so therefore in order to solve that problem it's not enough to conquer or to have arms, but one must change the moral understanding of men, or men's opinions about right and wrong, men's essential faith. And when Machiavelli starts talking about armies, which is what he's going to do now in chapters 12 through 14, he is, as you'll see, I think, speaking about armies in two senses of the word army. I mean, or you would say the real army, of men, but also a spiritual army and a spiritual warfare. Chapters 12 through 14 describe problems of warfare. Now, chapter Chapter 12 is an extreme attack on mercenary soldiers, and provides but let me begin by his fundamental statement, why it's important to talk about the military. And of course what comes out clearly in this chapter is, of course, that the church did not talk sufficiently about the military. But what does he say? We have said above that it was necessary for a prince to have laid good foundations, otherwise he will inevitably come to ruin. The principal foundations of all states, whether new or old or mixed, consist of good laws and good arms. And since there cannot be good laws where good armies are lacking, and where there are good armies there must be good laws, I shall leave aside the discussion of laws and speak about armed forces. And speak about armies. Now, that is a very, very extreme formula. You see, here it is. You need two things. You need you need a lot of force, you need a good police force, and you got to have good laws. Those two things are necessary for a state. I think everybody would admit that. You have the most perfect constitution in the world, but if the citizens can rebel or a foreign enemy can walk in, it doesn't mean a thing. So you got to have both of those. You got to have a good constitution, good laws, and a good police force to stand behind it. And perfectly sensible statement. But then he goes on to say to make what sounds, I think, incredible. Wherever you've got good armies, you've got good laws. So therefore, you have a unified cause. If you get good armies, then you're going to have good laws. Now that sounds like nonsense. But think it over. I think you could reformulate it in a modern terms that would be, well, almost absolutely credible to everybody, although I think the reformulation is in itself incredible. What is the formulation that one could make? The transformation was made. You see, good economy leads to a good political life. You know, you need a good political life and you need a good economy. But if you have a good economy, you'll have a good political life, so let's concentrate on economics. I believe that's the modern formula, isn't it? That's the same as Machiavelli's. Exactly the same. Meaning to say that the fundamental thing is not what men used to think it was, what Aristotle thought it was, you know, concentration on the characters of men, but on the conditions of political life. I mean, I think it's generally been assumed if you have rich economies, you know, and wealth everywhere, you know, in our times, that's what the whole distinction between developed and underdeveloped, which is a value thing, implies. And that's Machiavelli's transformation. The fact that he uses the terms armies is, I think, only secondary. See, for Aristotle, those were two distinct things. Now, Machiavelli's objection to Aristotle is quite powerful. That he talks about the good laws, and he doesn't talk about how you get them. And once you start thinking about how you get them, you realize that you have to break the good laws in order to get them. And so you can say he makes a fundamental, but then he goes one step further, a fundamental simplification. If you lower your goals or you change your goals, and you want to, you know, say stability, peace, prosperity, something of that kind, then you wouldn't have this dualism and the constant split between, you know, the duties of virtue and the need for equipment. And this is what he means by this, you know, shocking formulation. Let's concentrate on what really counts. Let's concentrate on the prerequisites. Worry about the good life later. First, you got to be alive in order to live the good life. But of course, but that also means you have to abandon the idea of the good life. You have to abandon the idea of the good life. Because if you say that life is more important than the good life, then it means to say that the good life is secondary. But if you say, let's live the good life, Machiavelli has a very strong argument, you're not able to live. And I still think that's, the, you know, as powerful way as formulating the, you know, the problem of political thought. And Machiavelli is just fantastic. You know, as I say, this is meant to be a brash formula. And here he makes a big attack on mercenary soldiers. And of course, what's the cause of mercenary soldiers? He makes it very clear: Christianity. Priests don't know how to fight. And hiring of foreigners. But I think if you read it very carefully, you'll see that this is a somewhat mitigated account. He puts it, here, Machiavelli suddenly takes the moral side. They have no fear of God, no faith in other men, and you're down to, you know, suddenly Machiavelli's in favor of fear of God. Of course, in a way it shows you have to have people who fear God, although you yourself don't fear God. Yeah, however that may be, he ends it with a very strong statement, you know, of Italian patriotism. Now you ask yourself why a man who says selfishness is the only thing should be an Italian patriot. Well, that's a good question. You would say certainly for the rhetoric of the case, if you're going to attack Christianity directly, you're not going to have much success. But if you praise patriotism, and one of the results of patriotism is an attack on Christianity, you're likely, you know, there are more people who are patriots simply than who, or at least there were then, than there are atheists. And I think there are probably now more atheists than there are patriots. But you'll also see that it's a mitigated attack on mercenaries, because you'll see that Sforza, you know, rose to power by mercenaries. And you'll see that in chapter 13, which is the argument in favor of having your own native troops, he discusses auxiliaries. Now, the auxiliaries are people who belong to somebody else, but who live in your country and help you out, but whose loyalty goes someplace else. Now, they in a way seem better. They're morally superior to mercenaries. Who do you think he's referring to if you remove this to a higher level? Who lives in your country but owes allegiance to somebody else and is hence more dangerous even than a mercenary? Priests altogether. I think that's that's his point. Just as he's always interested in who he can persuade, he's also interested in who the enemies are. And how do you get your own army? Well, I think you probably have to begin by mercenaries. I think you see, and his attack on mercenaries is qualified. Mercenaries are only attacked to the extent that they are a result of Christian unwillingness to fight. But mercenaries you can buy, and that's a good, solid common ground of motivation. Auxiliaries have too high a source of loyalty. Now he gives you, he stops to give you a little, I do not want to depart from using Italian examples. Nevertheless, it's always, he's always using Italian examples. I do not want to omit Hero of Syracuse. Where did we hear about him? End of chapter 6? Yeah, the one who's exactly like Moses, Romulus, and Theseus. Now, suddenly he's giving us the real story, whom I have mentioned previously. This man, as I said before, having been made head of the armed forces by the Syracusans, realized immediately that mercenary troops resembling our own Italian condottieri were useless, and it seemed to him that he could neither keep them nor dismiss them. So he had them all cut into pieces, and from then on he waged war with his own troops and not with those of others. Now you know what you've got to do. What you see, since Hero did what Moses and Romulus and Theseus did, but the interesting one is Moses, of course. You have to be a murderer. But he didn't say that then. Now he says it. And he says this is what Moses did, even though he had so great a preceptor. How did Machiavelli find out about this? The Bible doesn't say it. He knows from experienced modern actions. He knows from reading ancient actions. How does he know that these men behaved that way?
They must have. They were successful.
Well, or something. He's had to go something beyond history to a reflection on the fundamental conditions. But you see, that leads to something about the whole question. Why didn't the Bible tell about it? Machiavelli tells about it. I mean, actually, one reason, and you see in here he does a beautiful thing. When David offered himself, I would also like to recall to mind an example from the Old Testament, suitable for this argument. Suitable for this argument, it's wonderful. When David offered himself to Saul to go and fight against Goliath, the Philistine troublemaker, Saul, in order to encourage him, armed him with his own arms, which David, once he had them on, cast off, saying that with him he could not prove his true worth, and he wished rather to meet the enemy with his own sling and his own sword. Now, that's a wonderful use of the Bible, a way of handling the Bible, but there's an inaccuracy there, which I presumably you all know. He had to borrow the sword. Yeah. But Machiavelli, he provides him. Machiavelli improves the Bible here by providing David with his own sword. Yeah. He didn't go with his own sword, so he wasn't sufficiently armed. So Machiavelli gives a gradual improvement on the Bible. You see, you're supposed to, I mean, surely he knew these things, you see, and he was, he rewrites the Bible in a Machiavellian way. Here it gives a sample of what the new Machiavellian Bible would look like. One must have one. You see, the numbers are terribly important. And chapter 13 is a very important number in Machiavelli. and it usually contains his theological passages. This is chapter 13. When he refers to David in chapter 13 of the discourses, and so on. But so he's gradually leading, through this question of the military.
Chapter 13?
What? Yeah, I think it's chapter 13, maybe 26. What? It might be 26. Of the discourse. This is 26 of the discourse. Give me 13 quickly. Yeah, but let me look at 13. No, 13 is the way the Samnites, the Romans used the religion. The 26, but there are several places. 13, how of religion to preserve order in our city and to cause our enterprises, and then 26. The 26 of the discourses is this fantastic passage. I'm sure you'll know all these things. He said, that is, he should appoint new governors with new titles, new powers, and new men, and he should make the poor rich as David did when he became king, quote, who heaped riches upon the needy and dismissed the wealthy empty-handed. Does anybody you can see what's wrong with that?
Quotation from the New Testament.
No, but it was not like that, but that's from the Magnificat, and it's reference to God. And he calls that the behavior of a tyrant. This is,
godly king.
well, it's not that. I mean, he's really talking about God. Yeah, but it's also he's talking about that's right. Now, 14 again. I won't. He says, you see, the major thing is, well, now we recognize you have to have your own arms. Well, of course, knowing your own arm has led to this whole question of the mercenaries, of the way in which he enriches all these things, the mercenaries, the weakness of Christianity, the problem of the auxiliaries, the setting up of your own army. And then he says you must constantly be thinking about warfare, planning against your enemies. And then he says, but then you also must exercise your mind, not only your body. So you have to read the great men. I'm just going to mention this passage. I'll come back to it very, very quickly, but it's only after chapter 15. Just as it is said that Alexander the Great imitated Achilles, Caesar Alexander, Scipio Cyrus, and whoever reads the life of Cyrus, written by Xenophon, then realizes how important in the life of Scipio that imitation was to his glory, and how much in purity, affability, kindness, generosity, Scipio conformed to those qualities of Cyrus that Xenophon has written about. Look at the problem here. He says you're supposed to imitate the men of antiquity. Now, what did Cyrus do? Scipio. Scipio imitated Cyrus, but did he imitate Cyrus? Now, he imitated Xenophon's writing about Cyrus. Suppose you want to imitate Moses. Let's put Moses in here, since Cyrus is one of the four. How would you imitate Moses? By reading what the Bible said about him. This is where the problem of reading about the ancients as opposed to having experience of them is the problem. Suddenly the problem of writing, or of what was said about men, is terribly important. Is Scipio really imitating Cyrus? It's this problem of imitation. And suddenly comes the great chapter and the fantastic transformation that the moral transformation that Machiavelli works on those things for which men, and especially princes, are appraised or blamed. It's the center of the book, hardly noticeable, very quiet voice. He's talked all this blood and thunder, all these things, but that's not the shocking thing. He says, now there remains to be seen what ought to be the criteria and actions of a prince in dealing with his subjects and friends. Now he's talking about not foreign policy, and because I know, but we talk about domestic policy, where morality is supposed to be the highest, and because I know that many have written about this, I am afraid by writing about it again that I shall be thought presumptuous. Incidentally, it's this is maybe the third use of presumptuous. One would have to look at that. The first was Addressing himself to the prince might be thought presumptuous. The other was it would be presumptuous to talk about the reasons of the ecclesiastical polities. And now suddenly presumptuous again. All the more so for departing in my discussion of this material from the procedures of others. But my intention being to write something useful for whoever understands it, it seemed to me more appropriate to pursue the effectual truth of the matter rather than its imagined one. And many have imagined republics, but first let me say, this is the one place in The Prince where Machiavelli says he's doing something new. And I think he knew what his business, what he was about. You know, there were always tough people in the world and so on, but he's doing something new. And what is this something new? It's not all, you know, the tough Machiavellian politics, but it's a transformation, as you will see, in morality. And it's a very strange, as I say, very modest thing, but this is the real break. And what is it? He wants to pursue the effectual truth rather than the imagination. And many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in reality, where there's such a gap between how one lives and how one should live, that he who neglects what is being done for what should be done will learn his destruction rather than his preservation. For a man who wishes to profess goodness at all times must fall to ruin among so many who are not good, whereby it is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain his position to learn how not to be good and to use it or not according to necessity. Very simple thing. I mean, this one paragraph is the fundamental moral transformation in the whole tradition of political philosophy. I believe it's the most fundamental break. And he's now here, he's not referring to the specific institution of the church. He's referring to books, to writers. And the writers are obviously, on the one hand, the Bible, the city of God, imaginary republics, but also to Plato's Republic. This is an attack not only on Christian or biblical morality, it's an attack on the whole tradition of political philosophy. He's been led by these practical reflections to this larger. And this is the new thing. Now let me state in very, very simple terms, I mean, I'll keep coming back again to it, but what I believe to be the truly new thing about Machiavelli. There were always people who recognized the world as a nasty place. And I think Plato and Aristotle said that. I mean, that was not unknown. The difference between Machiavelli and Plato or Aristotle is that Machiavelli, instead of saying that you should try to temper men or moderate them or make them virtuous, control their natures, says that by private vice, public virtue can be attained. Let me say that he can make a public-spirited philosophy out of a selfish vision of man. You see, people, if you remember Thrasymachus in the Republic, people try to say that Machiavelli's like Thrasymachus. But if you think of the Republic and Thrasymachus, what does Thrasymachus say? Thrasymachus isn't a political philosopher. Thrasymachus says politics is a dog-eat-dog arena where there's no philosophy, there's no common good. So you should try to be a tyrant for your own sake, and it's not for anybody else's good. Machiavelli is going to suggest that this is what's good for civil society. That's the fantastic change, which finds its, sort of dumbed down or domesticated formula in things like utilitarianism's principle. Private vice makes public virtue, or the notion of enlightened self-interest. Something of that kind. Now, the problem is there have been imaginary republics. I mean, how can I put this? I really don't know how to put it. Which means to say, what did classical political philosophy say? Perhaps this is the best way to put it. Classical political philosophy said that implied in human action were certain goals about the good life, and therefore one should seek for, insofar as possible, the best regime, and to the extent that one does not achieve the best regime, one should make one's compromises in terms of the closest possible approximation to the best regime. So classical political philosophy culminated in both Plato and Aristotle in the elaboration of what we call a utopia, on the basis of which you judge men and judge civil societies. Machiavelli says those goals are illusory, merely imaginary, and they cause us to evaluate this world in terms of that other world. But this world, if you look at it without those imaginations, teaches us that we are not naturally directed towards the good. We are naturally directed towards preservation, or that what is ordinarily understood to be bad is really good, our selfishness. Now, of course, you can only adopt that viewpoint if you believe, well, I mean, taking it from the biblical point of view, that there's not a God who punishes, a God who rewards us, with the city of God, with his own city. Because what Machiavelli says, if you look at this world, this nature does not have that teleology built in it. You'll see that Machiavelli, prior to the fact of the transformation of natural science, begins to deny the teleological understanding, which is supposed to have been attacked by modern science, but I believe it really finds its sources in Machiavelli's political philosophy. Look at the real condition of human life in order to succeed at politics, and not merely in the selfish way, although he does speak of such, but in order to get peace, prosperity, stability, you have to abandon the high moral goals. And the simple fact is, what you get is, since nature forces us to be concerned about ourselves, and these imaginary republics force us to be considered about, to care about the common good or about our eternal salvation, that we neither satisfy the one nor the other. We don't do good politics, and at the same time, we are not virtuous men or truly pious men. You have an essential split in the world, but the essential split does not come from original sin, distinction between body and soul. It comes essentially from man's imaginations. And those imaginations we then erect into a reality by which we judge this world. We must erase those imaginations, then we can face the world as it really is. Excuse me. Yeah, that's part of the indication of the world as it really is. And if you look at the last paragraph, he gives a list of the virtues. And what he's going to do from chapters 15 or through 19 is a re-examination of the virtues, the classical virtues. If you'll notice the list, it has 11 pairs of virtues and vices. He's going to discuss some and leave others out. And the ones he leaves out, I presume he doesn't think are very important. For example, chastity he leaves out. Let me say, in the first place, you see, I mean, Machiavelli's argument is something like this. And people say, well, Machiavelli was only talking about politics. If he was, then he was only a very slight man, because if politics requires the eternal damnation of your soul, then you wouldn't do politics. So he had to reflect on that, unless he was simply a fool. And what he does is draw out what's necessary for politics and let you draw the conclusion that somehow or other you can say that God would not have made it impossible for man to live. Now, the list is amusing. I mean, in that it has, I mean, it's strictly two quick redundancies. There are a list of 11 virtues and vices, which is the same number as treated in Aristotle's Ethics. So he's referring, obviously, to Aristotle's Ethics. But you'll see two of them are the same here, or deal with the same thing. About avarice, the first ones, So it comes down to 10, which reminds of something. The Ten Commandments, yeah. And this is.
How do you get 10? What does he leave out?
Well, two are the same, when he said this is why some are considered to be generous, others stingy, and so on. Some are considered others graspers. It really is the same thing, and he's going to show it's the same thing. It's Machiavelli's Ten Commandments. Giving here, revealing, as he gradually reveals you see. So what's become the real center of the book? It's not, his discussion of political practice, but his discussion of what was written. You see, he in a way reanalyzed politics up through chapter 14, and then at the very end he comes down to this rock. You have to imitate the great men. But how do you know about the great men? You know about the great men from what's written about them. But men have always written about them wrong. Why have they written about them wrong? Because they concentrated on those moral virtues which are conventional. And therefore you have to, what's new, what's really required by Machiavelli is a new moral teaching to replace the old ones, which are, characteristically Plato's Republic and the Bible, if you like. Now, chapters 16 through 19 are the great discussion of morality and one of the most subtle analyses of the moral problems. I'll try to give some of that. I mean, obviously we can't do it, but it's the first one is about liberality and parsimony. Now, those of you who knows Aristotle's Ethics, which I'm sure all of you do, well, that's one of Aristotle's great moral virtues, giving money away. Now, what does Machiavelli say? Very simply, you see, it's a complicated. It's. Why don't you give him the text? It's page 131. Yeah. The first paragraph is the analysis. If you remember Aristotle's analysis of the virtues, it is the moral virtues are means between extremes. For example, liberality is a means between what do you say, tightness and
prodigality.
Yeah, prodigality. Isn't there a better word that's not so prodigality? A big spender, but wild spending, but there's something but prodigality. Well, all right, but we'll say prodigality if we like that. The parsimony and prodigality. And liberality is a what? What? Liberality is a means. Is the mean between the two. That's the Aristotelian analysis. You've got money, and you shouldn't hold on to it too much, but you shouldn't give it too much away. You should give it to the right people, and so on. Very simply, and that's a virtue. Now, what does Machiavelli say about that? The first thing he says is this: if you give away your money, you're going to run out of it. If you run out of it, then you're going to have to take it away from somebody else. Therefore, what he does is he breaks down the distinction between liberality and prodigality. You see, he's referring to Aristotle's notion, or he's referring to what he said about Aristotle earlier, that Aristotle doesn't talk about how you get it. Aristotle assumes people inherit money. And then they spend it. But what does he say? Then, you see, that leads to something, you see what he's indicated in the earlier list in chapter 15. Some people, you see, are rapacious, and other people stay off of other people's property. You see, now Aristotle hasn't talked about getting it. Yeah. Well, you see, staying away from other people's property is a part of justice. But here, Machiavelli, by doubling this up, raises the question of getting it. And you can only get it by taking it. So you have one of two choices, either taking it from other people, being a thief of some kind, or being tight. So Machiavelli comes out on the side of tightness. This is a fundamental moral reevaluation. And you can see this best developed, in terms of, well, what I think we all agree. Who is more important and more worthwhile? The man who gives charity, or the man who builds up a big firm and hires a lot of people for his own, for his own selfish good? Who's the bigger benefactor? Henry Ford, or the parish priest? Yeah. That a reevaluation of parsimony, what used to be considered tightness, meanness, becomes prudence, good management, something of the kind. You already see something. You see, what's called the Protestant ethic is not the Protestant ethic at all. It is the corruption of Protestantism by Machiavelli and his students. I'm not here making a defense of Protestantism in its pure form, but that does not come from Protestantism. It comes essentially from this kind of source. What Machiavelli suggests is, you see, that Aristotle's analysis of the virtues is an inadequate analysis, the analysis of the mean between the extremes, because there is no mean. You're forced into the extremes. Either you are tight, or you are prodigal. And that liberality. Now, it's a very powerful analysis. The only thing he doesn't deal with, isn't there really some human perfection that comes from the habit of giving? Isn't somehow a man's... You see, there are two senses of the word virtue in ordinary meaning. What's good for society, and also what makes a soul perfect. And Machiavelli really has to regard the virtues as instruments for the good of society, for the goods of the individual, rather than a perfection of the soul. He says that's Aristotelian talk. If the two, that just isn't a good analysis, he says. He says that, and he talks, you see, in this context about Caesar. Well, Caesar, of course, was prodigal when he was young, but he would have, but that's necessary for coming to power. And then he goes on to say, he makes one of these wonderful, on page 133, one of these wonderful Machiavellian distinctions, again, with perfectly straight face. And if someone were to reply that there have been many princes who with their troops have done great things and have been considered very generous, I would answer. Here, now this is really a perfect Thomistic distinguo. Yeah, either a prince spends his own money and that of his subjects, or he spends that of others. In the first case, he should be frugal. In the other, he should in no way hold back in his generosity. You see, it's perfectly one. There are two ways of being liberal. You have to understand that. You see, I could be liberal with my own money, or I could be liberal with your money if I take it from you. It's perfectly all right to be liberal with your money if I take it from you. It is not all right to be liberal with your own money. And then he goes on to say, and with that which does not belong to you or your subject, you can be a more liberal giver, as was Caesar or Alexander, because spending what belongs to others does not detract from your reputation, rather enhances it. You see, now Cyrus, he gives an example. Xenophon doesn't say this. Xenophon doesn't say that Cyrus took other people's. He says that Xenophon was very liberal. If you look at the end of chapter 14 again, he says, Scipio imitated Cyrus in his purity, affability, kindness, liberality, and so on. In his chastity, affability, humanity, and liberality. But now you can see Cyrus was liberal, but in what way was Cyrus liberal? He was liberal with what? The money he took from other people when he conquered them. That Scipio wouldn't find out by reading the life of Xenophon, the life of Cyrus written by Xenophon. You see, you have to have a new book. Now the question is whether the same wouldn't be true for Moses, yeah? The biblical account, yeah? The point is that Machiavelli here suggests a dual alternative, being a very a person who saves a lot. Xenophon, of course, if you read Xenophon carefully, you can see perfectly well that that's what Xenophon did. And his attack is not that Xenophon was ignorant. His attack was that Xenophon kept it a secret. Or as Machiavelli, or that Xenophon still encouraged in ordinary men, or even in statesmen, liberality in general, liberality in the traditional sense. Machiavelli makes a change, and the change is essentially the change of publishing this fact, making the vice somehow more respectable. Now, I'm arguing he's doing this for the sake of public spirit. I'll explain that in a little while. But here, in this first case, you see the combination both of what he means by liberality, his analysis of Aristotle's failure, and also you see the problem of imitation. You see, by mentioning Cyrus here, and having mentioned Cyrus in chapter 14, you put those two together and you realize that you need Machiavelli as a guide for understanding how to imitate Cyrus. Then 17 is on this question, cruelty and compassion, and whether it is better to be loved and feared or the opposite. Now, whether it's better to be, now you can see the importance of the very theme. Christianity is the religion of love. Now, Machiavelli begins by saying, moving along to the other qualities mentioned above, let me say that every prince must desire to be thought of as compassionate and not cruel. However, he must be careful not to misuse this compassion. And here comes Machiavelli's real moral intention. You can see it stated, this is 137. Cesare Borgia was reputed to be cruel. Nonetheless, his cruelty had brought order to Romagna, united it, brought it peace and obedience. If we examine this carefully, we see that he was much more compassionate than the Florentine people, who, in order to avoid the reputation of being cruel, allowed Pistoia to be destroyed. And I'm, of course, very impressed with that argument. Think of those wonderful pacifists in England in the 30s, who felt such a wonderful conscience. And well, we're getting them again, so sensitive, to the miseries of mankind, always for peace. And Churchill, that cruel warmonger, about the way they talked about him in the 30s. Machiavelli hates that. I mean, he hates weak justice more than he hates vicious men. And that, I must say, in a personal way, I do too. I have a certain way of hating those French and British softies. Some of them were practical softies, others were theoretical softies, than I do Hitler. Because Hitler is madman. And that's not the problem. The problem is the people who allow such a man to gain power, for whose responsibility it is. And Machiavelli, of course, tries to teach that the human condition is such that we are always at the edges of barbarism, and that the weak turn over, or put it this way, that the just men or the good men turn over the world's the unjust or evil men when they refuse to use the arms of the unjust and the evil. That the purity of their souls allows them an out against taking their responsibilities. The problem with this, of course, is once you abandon it, especially so explicitly as Machiavelli does, the distinction between good and bad, and what is the difference between the good and the bad? When you're trying, in trying to defend yourself against the bad, do you not make yourself bad? So that's the moral problem of Machiavelli. But what he claimed is our morality, particularly the biblical, but also the classical morality, disarmed us. And this comes out in this passage about Cesare Borgia. So that leads into the question of fear rather than love, or fear as opposed to love. And his answer is very simply, it is better to be feared than to be loved. Because love depends upon the other person. Fear depends upon you. You can make men afraid. Love is a kind of spiritual action at a distance. And he makes a general statement. Most men are not good. Now, that's only, you say, a provisional statement. They're only good in the context if faith and loyalty and so on are terribly good. I mean, but Machiavelli has doubt about that. But the point is that it's a lovely disposition to count on the faith of others, but fear is something that really produces obedience. Now, people say, all right, this is Machiavelli, the source of modern tyranny. It is not. It's the source of that's Machiavelli, the source of modern democracy. Because what is modern democracy based upon? Self-preservation or fear of death. The state which is to protect us. That's what Hobbes and Locke did. They said fear. Fear is what should attach you to government. Fear of war. Fear of death. That's Machiavelli's point. You can count on that. He says everybody will say, oh, how wonderful it is to be loyal to your king or to your government or to your friend. But you can't count upon men acting in terms of that when they're in danger, but you can always count on them acting in terms of fear and greed. Establishing morality on a much solider basis if the motive is your own self-preservation, your own good, rather than the good of somebody else. But here, of course, he goes so far, he said, you must not be hated, you must just be feared. You see, he hasn't gone to the depths at this point. There's always some harmony here. And he puts this statement, he said, what you should do is you should leave their wives and their children and their money alone. Reasons for taking another's possessions are never lacking, and inevitably he begins the great formulation is, men forget more quickly the death of their fathers than the loss of their patrimony. That may not be 1,000% true, but there is a certain truth in it. That if you know that you're going to have your property, you probably won't become a revolutionary. But if they take away your property, you've got nothing to lose, you will. Whereas your father, well, you'd say, you feel terrible about it, but I'm impotent, I can't do anything about it. And then in this context, and this leads you back to Agathocles, among the admirable accomplishments of Hannibal is numbered this, that with a very large army composed of men of all races which he led into battle on foreign lands, there never arose any kind of dissension, neither among themselves nor against the prince during his bad as well as good fortune. This could not have come about from anything other than at inhuman cruelty, which, together with his infinite virtues, always made him revered and terrifying. Now, that may remind you of the end of chapter 11. the last sentence of chapter 11 again. Con la bontà e infinita altra sua virtù, with his goodness and his infinite other virtues, and here it is, the same formula, his inhuman cruelty with his infinite other virtues. Isn't that funny? And then he goes on, we come back to Scipio, and that it is true that his other qualities would not have sufficed can be seen in the case of Scipio, a most outstanding figure not only of his own time but of all recorded time, whose troops in Spain turned against him. This came about from nothing other than his excessive leniency, which allowed his soldiers more liberty than the military code would normally provide, and so on. Scipio was too soft. Why was Scipio too soft? Because he read Xenophon about Cyrus and didn't understand Cyrus. Who does Scipio most resemble in this book, the ancient heroes, I believe Jesus, You see, and Jesus, Moses, the Bible plays the same role. You see, I think you would have this. Cyrus, Xenophon, Scipio, Moses, Bible, Jesus. I believe that's the... He can talk about Xenophon, but he doesn't talk about him all that directly. Now, is that clear? I mean, 1670, he's dealt with these two fundamental virtues, liberality or charity, and with love and fear. And now he turns to the question of faith. This is a beautiful statement. And of course, his young faith has all the ambiguities of faith. He says, you should use it. You should try to be as faithful as possible. But then he makes a distinction. You should know that there are two ways of fighting, one with the law and the other with force. The first way is peculiar to man, the other to beasts. But since the first in many instances is not enough, it becomes necessary to resort to the second. You see, the human, according to Machiavelli's teaching, the human good things don't have any support in nature or from God. Therefore, the only support they have is from man. And since law comes from man, there is something prior to law. And prior to law, there can't be law. So in order for there to be law, there has to be bestiality. And he who wants to establish law, which is a good thing, must always recognize he must be bestial. And then he takes this beautiful story of Achilles, who was educated by Chiron the centaur. And what does that mean according to Machiavelli? As Bacon put it, Machiavelli ingeniously but corruptly interprets it as meaning to say man must be half man, half beast. So this is his teaching. That man is always understood to be a halfway being. You can't understand man simply. And the previous tradition regarded man as, half human and half divine. Machiavelli says you cannot use the divine. It has to be half man, half beast. But then look at the next sentence. Since a prince must know how to make good use of the beast, he should choose then the fox and the lion. For the lion has no protection from traps, and the fox is defenseless against wolves. It is necessary, therefore, to be a fox in order to know the traps, and a lion to frighten the wolves, and so on. Now, what does that paragraph really say? He talked about Chiron in the previous half man, half beast. What does he talk about here? All beast. man is a combination of lion and fox, not man and horse. Machiavelli recognizes, this is what's wonderful about Machiavelli, is he's very clear-sighted, he's unsentimental, that if you abandon the divine, then the bestial in man has to be the guide completely. Now, it's very important to recognize that he says both the lion and the fox. The problem, you see, Machiavelli in this book, particularly when talking to Lorenzo, keeps talking about the lion, the tough thing, roar, roar, roar. Whereas the fox side is sort of hidden. And Machiavelli, of course, represents the fox-like. Most of all. But that he mentions Alexander VI as the perfect liar and deceiver. And then he ends his statement here on the moral virtues, that they are means to ends, that one cannot simply, use them as ends in themselves. That the older teaching was that they were means to ends and also ends in themselves. But Machiavelli says to the extent that they are means to ends, they conflict with the ends in themselves, and that the political demands that they be used as means to ends. Then in chapter 19, which is the longest chapter. Oh, by the way, there's something I wanted to talk about that's just passing. I'm terribly sorry, I got to go back to chapter 9 to show you something about Machiavelli that will amuse you. I'm sorry for interrupting my narrative. I will finish, I promise, by 4:15 we began. At 2:15, I think. And I think 2 hours is as much as can properly be asked to. Chapter 9 of the Civic Principality, where I talked about them. That passage which was the beginning of democracy or a democratic argument. He says a prince must, page 79, third paragraph, he talks about the nobility. And he says, to clarify this part more fully, let me say that the nobles should be considered mainly in two ways. He says you have to get rid of all the old nobility. Either they conduct themselves in such a way that they wholly ally themselves to your fortunes, or they do not. Those who ally themselves and are not greedy should be honored and loved. You see, you're supposed to ally with the people, get rid of all the dangerous noblemen, but then there are some who shouldn't. Those who do not ally themselves can be analyzed in two ways. They act this way out of cowardice and a natural lack of courage, in which case you should make use of them, especially those who are wise counselors, for in times of prosperity they will bring you honor, and in adverse times you have nothing to fear from them. However, when they, and so on. What's he talking about? Why does he go into this detail here? However, when they do not ally themselves to you for a definite reason, for ambitious purposes, it's a sign they are thinking more about themselves than about you, and the prince should watch out for such men. You should fear them as their open enemies. He tells you which nobles to keep and which nobles to get rid of. The central example is nobles who weren't on your side, but the reason why they weren't on your side is they were such cowards. And they could be very clever advisors, and you should use them because they're too cowardly to do anything, but they can be smart. What's he talking about? He's talking about himself. You have to think about this. You see the problem he's got. We got this from the Epistle Dedicatory. He's talking to a prince. A prince can regard him as a threat. Now Machiavelli, this is historical. Machiavelli talks about himself, was on the side of the Republic. You see, when it failed, then he was stuck there. So he has to explain. And he's just come to a passage when he's talked about you can't trust anybody of the nobility, or you should get rid of the nobility. And he's also a passage where he's also said, there is no moral basis for politics. It's merely, self-interest. So therefore, his position has become called into question. So he explains, don't worry about me. I'm one of the cowards one of the clever cowards you can use. You see, throughout the book, you'll see, what's gradually becoming the case is, I think, clear, is that Machiavelli believes himself to be the proper prince, the true founder of a new moral order. But of course he has to deal with the real princes that are in place. So at different places he gives them different explanations. There's an epistle dedicatory, he wants to give a gift because he wants a job. Now he's explaining why. Now that he's pointed out that everybody's self-interested, well, he can point out that his self-interest would be in his cowardice. It's a funny passage. There'll be another such passage. He frequently refers to himself in this hidden way in the book. Now, chapter 19 goes more into, well, I mean, it's a funny chapter, and it's the longest chapter in The Prince, and therefore it requires some explanation. It's this long history of the Roman emperors and so on. But what's this explicit theme, and see if we can put it together. Let me tell you that this chapter is, in a way, the most important chapter in The Prince, the most revealing. It's the place where Machiavelli dips down lowest, where the moral teaching is the lowest. He said in chapter 17 that it's better to be feared than to be loved, but you should avoid being hated. Now he deals with this question of whether, he tells you should avoid being effeminate or weak, being contemptible, and being hated. He develops that theme. Now, you see, chapter 17 was a certain problem. You suggest to a prince that he should be feared and not loved, so that his motive should be keeping people afraid. But there seems to be not a moral basis, but an inner protection of the people in that case. An inner protection because, well, at least the prince shouldn't be hated, because if he's hated, then they'll try to kill him, so that'll keep him from being too extreme. He'll be tough, but not too extreme. Now he reconsiders that issue. Love is out. And he says you should avoid being both contemptible, because then people will take you, to take advantage of you, and you should avoid being hated. But it becomes perfectly clear if you read the chapter with any care that, of course, the person who wants to be loved is the one who's contemptible. And that the only thing is really to avoid being contemptible. Put it this way, the way in which he analyzes it in chapter 19, the analysis follows something like this. In ordinary situations, what you have is the people, the prince, and the people should be satisfied by the prince. And the prince depends upon the people's obedience, and the people depend upon the prince to take care of them. Wonderful situation, a perfect sort of harmony of self-interests. And of course the prince should therefore avoid being hated, because the people will rebel. But there are some cases when there's a third force, the army, which is what happened in the Roman Empire. And this is now, in the case of the Roman Empire, of course, the army was rapacious and took things away from the people. In that case, you have to choose whether you're going to be hated by the people or despised by the army. And what must you choose? Being hated by the people. Therefore, it's possible to do anything, not to have any moral restraints. There's no, or not either moral restraints or factual restraints. It's possible to be hated by the people if you have a strong enough army. It's in this context, by the way, that he compares the Turks with the papacy, with the Praetorian Guard. And the army of the papacy is obviously the priesthood, which is rapacious, and so on. But in his teaching. But the point is, what Machiavelli suggested, that one didn't have to be public-spirited, but this would automatically lead to the public good, that he had a new technique of each one following his self-interest. The oppressed people and the ambitious prince. Now suggests that harmony is not universal, that there are conditions where it is perfectly all right to be hated, and one would have to be hated, and therefore it's Therefore, it's unreasonable to, or no, put it this way, that there is, as it were, a perfect moral anarchy at certain points if one analyzes the situation. And that, of course, is a very ugly teaching. You see, what Machiavelli has done is this. What's the problem with old political philosophy or with Christianity? In order to have a good political life, you have to love your country, your fatherland. What does Christianity do? Or what does Plato do? It causes you to love something more than your country. It takes you beyond your country. So what do you have to do in order to love your country and be devoted to politics? You have to cut off that alternative, cut off that force which leads you or attracts you beyond your country. That's beautiful. Then you're back to what you might call patriotism or nationalism, if you like, or something like that. But when you cut off that top and you say that you should be devoted to the country, why should you be devoted to the country? Not for the sake of moral virtue, but for your own good. There can't be any other basis. I mean, why should you love your country? I mean, the old way was you love your country because your country will lead to salvation or make you a good man. If that's no longer the end, then what's the end of the country? It's taking care of you. But if sometimes it's to your interest to exploit the country, then you should. The point is, both alternatives, that the country is a kind of imperfect unity. It really is the whole. You're either led beyond it in the direction of morality, or below it or beneath it in the direction of individualism. But Machiavelli prefers the latter, to try to reconstruct by the way of individualism, which of course is what, Hobbes and Locke, the whole modern tradition, the individual, contracting, with society. But there is no question that if Machiavelli is a nationalist or a patriot or something like that, it's a patriotism on a totally new basis. He makes his analysis in this way. He takes the 10 Roman emperors, only 2 of them come out as good. One of them is Marcus Aurelius, who's kind of peak, the philosopher. And what does he say about Marcus Aurelius? He was a very good ruler, but he was completely conventional. He, in a way, depended, upon the inheritance and so on. That's what made him so respectable. The real ruler, the one who knows how to rule, is Severus, the perfect lion, the perfect fox, the new prince. Severus, the perfect example of a tyrant that ever lived. And he's the perfect ruler. He's the one that we know of from more accurate history who should be our guidance if we wanted to found new modes and orders. That really is the ugliest moral teaching in the book. But it's the facts about politics, and he's prepared us for this, and he hides it in this chapter. The one thing one must not be is contemptible, and the man who is soft, which means to be humane, who lives on love, is contemptible. What's the difference between Machiavelli and Jesus? Well, they both were unarmed prophets. But Machiavelli was in a way an armed prophet because he identified himself with human selfishness, which is something that always works. Jesus was based upon love and was hence contemptible. Something of this kind would seem to be the argument. But as on avoid being, you're here this heading, on avoid being hated, despised, and hated, what it comes out as is you should always avoid being despised. Sometimes, and particularly a new prince, must probably be hated by the people and perform the most tyrannical acts. And that's the end, you can say, of the moral analysis, the new morality, the clear-sighted political morality, book chapters 15 through 19. Now, I'm going to just say a very few words about 21 through 24, 21 through 20 through 23. I mean, they're very interesting, and so on. But they become more conventional. Machiavelli, the Prince has moved in this way, if you'll see, chapters 1 through 6, an ascent to the highest thing. 7 and 8, a descent morally. 9 through 14, generally speaking, an ascent. Then again, this the new moral teaching, downward, and then upward again. A, to conventional morality, and B, to the great liberation of Italy, to conventional morality in general. Now, 20. Deals with the question of fortresses, and here, well, I can't speak about it very well. He makes it clear that this is a case for prudence, and so he begins to concentrate more on prudence, less on moral extremes. He refers to himself again on page 179. Princes, and primarily those who are new, have found more loyalty and usefulness than those men who at the beginning of their reign were held in suspicion. That's Machiavelli, use me. Chapter 21, the use of religion in particular to gain esteem. And in those contexts, he talks about the pious cruelty of Ferdinand of Spain, and so on. 21, 22, and 23 are about advisors to princes. Again, he suggests that what Ernest was talking about at lunch, somebody who's wise himself, somebody who can listen to wisdom, somebody who doesn't, who's incapable of both. But in chapter 23, he makes it perfectly clear that the second alternative, that there's only one way. You've got to be wise yourself. Because if you rely on a wise advisor, what will he do? He'll take away your and there he makes it perfectly clear that he has to read very carefully, that in a way Machiavelli himself will become the prince. There's no substitute for wisdom. But chapters 20 through 23 I will not insist on. They're quite important. I can't formulate their importance at this moment so very well, and we've hit them all. And then the last segment, chapters 24 through 26, which 25 is the central chapter. 24, and this passage is a passage of great exhortation, which apparently is for the unification of Italy. My suggestion, of course, is that it's not really a unification of Italy. I think he's tried to show you here in the book how impossible it would be without fundamental transformations to unify Italy, that it is more of an example than of a thought that goes much further. What he says in 24, what are the sins of our times? The sins of our times. Cowardice, lack of courage, and lack of concentration on our own virtue. And then in chapter 25, you see, he's suggesting we can do great things. And chapter 5 is the other fundamental theoretical statement, in addition to chapter 15 of the Prince. And what is that fundamental theoretical statement? It's about fortune. This is what we've been dealing with all along. What does virtue mean? What does fortune? Virtue means somehow what you can do on your own. Fortune fortune means something, and here he's going to explain it somehow and tells you. In a certain extent, fortune means, very simply, it's what's out of human control. What human beings can't do. You know, in the old view, if you think of Stoicism, for example, that's as good a formula for the, the Stoics knew that you could lose your wife, lose your empire, lose your life. But they say, well, happiness doesn't depend on that. Happiness depends upon the virtue of my soul. Only virtue counts. But of course in politics, so much depends upon whether you lose your country, and so on. We are dependent on fortune, or so it seems. Now, I'll try to do all of this a little bit more clearly, but first let me present the way Machiavelli presents it. I am not unaware that many have been and still are of the opinion that worldly affairs are in a way governed by fortune and by God, that men with their wisdom are not able to control them, indeed that men can do nothing about them, and for this reason they would conclude that there is no point in sweating much over these things. Instead, let them be governed by chance. This opinion has been held more in our own day because of the great changes in things that have been observed and are being observed every day that are beyond human imagination. Now, the first thing to say about this is, in the beginning here he identifies fortune and God, anything that's out of our control. Now, what's the ordinary opinion? You can say, well, that God and fortune control everything, that man should wait in pious assent, pious acceptance. But it's interesting to note that fortune and God are the same here. That fortune and God are the same in this context, and that is what man can't control. And he says, because there's so many great changes in the world, everything seems to be due to fortune. Now, the first implication of that is, of course, that if you leave things alone and don't really do anything and don't try to control things, then everything is due to fortune. And then men can say, aha, it's our fortune. But however that may be, let's look at the analysis. But then he says very piously, God wanted us to have our freedom. Therefore, he left 50% to him, or to fortune, and 50% to us. And the 50% is, we ought to build up dikes and so on. And when we build up dikes, then there won't be floods, but of course the floods seem like complete fortune if you haven't tried to build dikes. And God wanted us to do this. So this seems like a praise of God. God is there, fortune is there, but 50% is left to us. Then suddenly, he suggests, he goes on further though. What is the cause of men succeeding sometimes and not succeeding sometimes? Their character. That's the next paragraph. See, sometimes you need to be bold, and sometimes you need to be moderate or cautious. Now, if you're a bold man in circumstances that require boldness, you always succeed. If you're a timid man or a cautious man in times that require caution, you succeed. But if you're a bold man in times that require caution, you fail. If you're a cautious man in times that require boldness, you fail. Now, what does that come down to? What is fortune in that case? I mean, do you see, am I making that clear? I mean, fortune then is nothing outside, it's just your character. If you happen to be a cautious man in a time requiring boldness, then it would be fine. But why can't men have both characters, being timid and bold, both, or cautious and bold, both? He at one point suggested you can change your nature. So from that point of view, then there'd be no fortune at all. But fortune is in not having the right character at the right time. Not in anything in nature that's uncontrollable. Then he goes on to say, and he takes the example of Pope Julius, who was always impetuous. You see, in this implication is to see that these miraculous changes that occur are miraculous only because men have not controlled the situation. And he finishes in this way. I conclude then that fortune varying and men remaining fixed in their ways, while the two are in accordance with each other, men are prosperous, and when they are in discord, unprosperous. I am certainly convinced of this, that it is better to be impetuous than cautious, because fortune is a woman, and it is necessary if one wishes to hold her down to beat her and fight with her. And we shall see, we see that she allows herself to be taken over more by these men than by those who make cold advances. And then, being a woman, she is always the young man's friend, because they are less cautious, more reckless, and with greater audacity command her. What is a fantastic statement, that fortune is a woman, and she can be raped. And who's the better rapist? A young man. What's his argument here? You can say this is the beginning of the modern youth movement. What was the old thing about who should rule? Older men, because they're calm, in control of their passions, moderate, and so on. Although sometimes we know that doesn't work, but that's the best general thing. Why? Because the world, there are unpredictable things in the world. Man can't control everything. Classical politics was moderate precisely. You shouldn't dare too much. You shouldn't try too much, because there are limits to what human beings can do. You can say perhaps Christianity went even further with doctrines of providence and so on. But both tended to moderation in politics. What does Machiavelli really suggest in this chapter? There is no fortune, or that fortune is only men's incapacity, not incapacity, but man's lack of adapting himself when he could adapt himself to certain kinds of circumstances. See, the ancient, and this leads to a great question of metaphysics. Is there such a thing as chance in the world? The old view was that there was just chance, that, and therefore men should have moderate hopes, not try to do too much. The modern notion, and this fits with modern science. I mean, Descartes, who followed Machiavelli, was a reader of Machiavelli, Descartes' science said there is no chance, everything is ultimately predictable. If everything, and Descartes' famous formula, really, which is man can become master and possessor of nature, follows from this. The transformation of nature, or the control of nature for man's needs and wishes. This is the great thing, along with the moral, or in combination with that moral teaching, that one can have greater hopes from politics if one changes one's goals and one's standard. Plato and Aristotle really taught that, of course, one should always go for the best, but one should expect at very most a moderate success, and that one should precisely, that it wouldn't be worth giving up high demands for the sake of great realizations, because those great realizations were highly threatened. The notion of the command and total control of the political sphere, the use of the youthful passions, the mastering passions, that this fundamental change in possibility, you see, you can say these two things, the changing of the goals of politics, you can say the lowering of the standards, plus great hopes in the realization of of man's controlling his own fate. Those two things are Machiavelli's great contribution. And, the whole idea of modern science, say, which can control fortune, can change man's fundamental situation in the world. That's all Machiavelli's beginning, at least. And that's the reason why chapters 15 and 25 are the two most capital theoretical chapters. They can't be separated out from the book, because one has to see the argument. I mean, one can master the political destiny if precisely one doesn't believe in miracles, if one doesn't demand too much. if one rests oneself on low and solid grounds. But it leads to great daring, great transformation of men, and so on. That very much of the difference between ancient and modern politics can be summed up in this difference between moderation and daring. Now, chapter 26 is this great poem for all of this book has somehow been supposedly for the unification of Italy. And he talks about the situation. It is a situation. It was necessary in order to see the capability of Moses that the people of Israel be slaves in Egypt, and to know the great courage of Cyrus that the Persians be oppressed by the Medes, and to know the excellence of Theseus that the Athenians be scattered. Likewise, at the present time, in order to recognize, he forgets somebody. Why?
Well, but he's talking about Israel.
Yeah, but then you think he would most of all mention Romulus.
We need a new Romulus.
Sure, you need a new Romulus. Perhaps that's because it's a pre-Christian. Possibly, how did Romulus found the city? Directly by murdering his brother. What does he say in chapter 6 about, I just want to check on that, I forgot myself, about what